Welcome back to Power and Politics. We're coming to you live from Gatineau over in Quebec, where we are counting down to the final federal leaders debate of this election campaign. The countdown is there on the corner of your screen, less than an hour to go. And hello as well to our viewers joining us on our live stream. A little later on in the hour, we're going to be taking some of your questions about the debate. The Power panel will try and answer as many as they can. So post those questions in the comment section on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Meanwhile, I'm here with Hannah Thibodeau, the CBC's Hannah Thibodeau. You have been outside in the crowd for the duration of this evening, seeing all the leaders, the various leaders arrive. A lot of speculation going into this debate focused on Bloc leader Yves-François Blanchet and how his upswing in popularity, his party's climb in the polls over the last 4 weeks might change the dynamic of this debate for other leaders as well as for himself.
I think it absolutely will change the dynamic. I was traveling with Liberal leader Justin Trudeau this week, and it was interesting because you know that it's likely you're going to lose seats across the country and other regions. That's what he's thinking. And then they were hoping to pick up many of those seats in Quebec. But now with that upswing and the uptick with the Bloc Québécois, it shows that, wait a minute, maybe they're not going to pick up the number of seats they had hoped for in Quebec, which could cause him big problems on election day. Because if they start taking away some of that support in this province that has 78 seats and they were hoping to pick up more than the 40 they currently have, it could cause a big difference for them, in particular majority, minority, or even potentially not becoming the next prime minister again.
And it's interesting because so much of the focus going into the campaign was on Quebec being the path to a majority for the Liberals. And now I feel like, and I don't know if you have this sense as well, but every conversation that takes place around possible scenarios mostly involves a minority situation. So much so that we even saw Jagmeet Singh this morning basically say, here are my terms for if that happens and I hold the balance of power. I mean, he said a lot more than that, but that was the messaging around
And I think that's the messaging he wants to get out there and saying, look, I'm doing well now in the polls. I want to pick up more steam so that they can actually become the balance of power because, look, if the Bloc surges too, there could be, if a minority situation, that the Bloc could become the balance of power. So he's saying, here are my terms. He's already said he's not going to work with a minority conservative government. So he's essentially saying, here's my top 5 things, Liberal government, that I want from you if you want to make this work and be a partnership, if that is to happen.
We saw Mr. Blanchet in the English debate a few days ago on Monday evening, sort of making probably his first impression on the rest of Canada. Quebec voters are going to be a bit more familiar with him. How do you expect, I mean, I don't know if you saw this, but he looked a lot tenser to me walking in today. And of course, he has a controversy he's dealing with around some candidates and their anti-Islamic social media posts right now, and he was getting lots of questions. But he looked a lot more stressed out or tense today than he did on Monday when he arrived. Well, a little bit more to lose this time.
Absolutely. On Monday, he had nothing to lose. He could be in this game and just kind of keep putting the jabs out there. Today, though, we know that there's going to be a larger French population watching him, and he has a lot on the line. In particular, when you start to surge in the polls, people are going to keep their eyeballs on you a lot more. And you could tell, I felt, when he walked in today as opposed to the other day, that he did seem a bit more tense, but like you say, there was the controversy. All those questions were coming in the crowd from the reporters about that, and they wanted to get some answers on it. And I was trying to get any English question in there. It just wasn't happening, but there was one quick one to him in English as well on the same controversy. But I think he is feeling the pressure, and the pressure becomes more intense when your popularity rises.
And it's not just the public that will increase the scrutiny and their focus on him. It's what it's going to be tonight too. You can expect, I'm sure, other leaders to start narrowing their criticism of him and their attacks on him.
Right, and in particular, Justin Trudeau. One of the things I bet you will hear tonight, and we can chat later if I'm right, is, and we heard it from Justin Trudeau yesterday on the campaign trail, we were talking about this, and what he was saying is essentially, look, he can't become a national leader. You don't want to put your vote with him. Not only that, we know Quebecers are, one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue for them is climate change. And he says, you can't have a national climate plan with a leader that only represents one province. How is he going to fight against Doug Ford? How is he going to fight against Jason Kenney, who want to get rid of the carbon tax? So that's what he's trying to pitch, and I bet you we'll hear similar things in there tonight.
I bet you, and I bet you'll see attacks from other leaders as well, directed to Mr. Blanchet. It should be fascinating. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks for having me.
CBC's Hannah Thibodeau. 54 minutes to go. So where do the parties stand as we count down to this French language debate, the final debate of election 2019? And what will it take to stand out, especially in Quebec? Stay tuned for that discussion with the CBC's Eric Grenier and Shachi Kurl from the Angus Reid Institute. First, though, a debate primer. Tonight's debate will be slightly different than what we saw on Monday evening. Here's a rundown of exactly what you can expect. The 2-hour debate will be divided into 5 topics: economy and finances, environment and energy, foreign policy and immigration, identity, ethics and governance, and services to citizens. In each segment, there's a lot to get through. There will be a question from a Canadian, then open debate between 3 of the 6 leaders, then open debate from the remaining 3 leaders, and then questions in quick succession from a journalist.
The national debate, live and in color.
Encounter 79.
Live from Ottawa.
Debates have long been a moment in the campaign for leaders to lay out their promises and directly challenge their opponents, in person, on a national stage. Now, though, we hear from leaders on the campaign trail kind of every day, often live on TV and social media. As one political scientist put it, quote, "In this new media landscape, it seems probable that debates will exert even less direct impact than they did in the 1980s and 1990s. So can they change the outcomes of elections, and how much do debates matter anyway? Depending on who you talk to and what you read, just how useful they are and how much impact they can have, well, it's up for debate. Party strategists will tell you they're key.
It's really important.
A debate is a huge inflection point in a campaign and continues to be so.
I think debates do influence voters.
Academics have long been researching whether that's actually true. Often, it depends on the election.
We can identify certain debates that have had an impact on the bottom line of vote intention. Most debates, most of the time, however, don't have discernible impact.
That's Richard Johnston. He's a political scientist at the University of British Columbia. Other political scientists agree, including Andre Blais of the University of Montreal. He says, quote, "My research suggests that debates can change vote intentions, though they often do not."
Mr. Mulcair has said he doesn't think we should be in this fight at all.
Debates may be the most watched event during an election, but political scientists say the majority of the population doesn't tune in. And those who do are already pretty engaged in politics.
A large part of that audience is just looking for confirmation. Now, sometimes they could be looking for a kind of reassurance.
In fact, academics also point out many people get their information about the debate from how it's condensed in news coverage and on social media.
So, in fact, if you look at debates that do seem to change things, a lot of the change unfolds as people learn about the debate in the news stream.
Also some reaction from people in Quebec to the French language debate last night. Don, aside from the press reaction in Montreal, what was the reaction in terms of the leaders themselves?
Well, of course, the leaders all think they won.
More often than not, it's a short-term change that is reversed. So it's like a pulse that then goes away.
Welcome back. You're watching a special extended edition of Power in Politics. We're coming to you from the Canadian Museum of History over in Gatineau, Quebec for Debate Night Take 2. This time, 6 party leaders will face off in French in less than an hour, 50 minutes there to be exact. How could tonight make or break a party's chances? Shachi Kurl is the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. She joins us from Vancouver. And over in Ottawa, in our Ottawa studios, Eric Grenier is CBC's polls analyst. Hi to both of you. Great to see you again.
Hello. Hey, Beshi. Hey, Eric. Hi.
Shachi, let me start with you. I want to set the sort of stage for our viewers to begin with. What are you seeing in Quebec right now?
Well, fresh from the oven, or more like our computer terminal, we are seeing brand new numbers from the Angus Reid Institute showing, look, the Bloc is really coming along. We're seeing gains for the Bloc in Quebec. This has been a race up to this point that the Liberals have really been able to hold the high ground on in La Belle Province, so it represented a fighting chance for the incumbent party in terms of its re-election prospects. But, you know, Monsieur Blanchet had a good outing in the initial French debate. People seem to think he was doing okay in the English debate. He didn't have a lot of pressure on him. And as a result, we are starting to see the Bloc really surge in Quebec, according to new numbers that we've just put out this afternoon. The other piece of the dynamic, slightly away from the French debate, but the boom-bust echo of the English debate continues to be an NDP bump on the strength of Jagmeet Singh's performance in that debate. And where we're really seeing the NDP come up and really into play is in British Columbia, a place where traditionally the party's done well. Earlier in the campaign, it was sort of competing and scrapping with the Greens for third place, but is now starting to put some daylight both nationally and in British Columbia between itself and the Greens, and starting to even come up into real contention and play with the Liberals. So overall, the national picture and that regional picture in Quebec, you know, the Liberal vote continues to dilute, continues to spread out, but we do continue to see a lot of shakiness with that center-left vote and a lot of lack of certainty, even today, not even 2 weeks out from voting day, with advanced voting starting tomorrow.
10 days out. Yeah, I want to pick up on that point around uncertainty and specific to Quebec. Let me get you to zero in on that, Eric. The idea of the Bloc and the upswing that they're seeing right now, and that they have sort of incrementally seen over the first few weeks of this campaign, and then more so just in the past week. If that affects a party or more than one party, how does it affect them in Quebec, Eric?
Well, I think we've seen that pretty much everybody but the New Democrats seems to be impacted by the rising Bloc numbers in the province. The Liberal numbers are looking weaker, particularly among Francophones. We saw a Léger poll showing the Liberals trailing by double digits among Francophones. That is a big problem for Justin Trudeau. We've seen that the Conservative numbers have just been heading down in Quebec ever since the TVA debate, the first French language one, in which Andrew Scheer was widely seen, and the polls have shown that he was the loser of that debate. And so there's been a lot of space opened up for Yves-François Blanchet and the Bloc Québécois in the province. The polling suggesting that he did very well in the TVA debate. So I think that the issue for him now is that he is at the focus of everybody in the province. Everybody needs to take down the Bloc a couple pegs, because they are really worried about their own potential for picking up seats. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives have been eyeing Quebec as a place where they can make some gains. I think right now both of them are starting to look at the numbers and starting to worry about the seats that they already held, and if they're going to be able to hold them if the Bloc continues to creep up in the polls.
Should they be worried, Shachi?
Well, I think, you know, should they be worried? 10 days out, I think anything is possible, as cliched as that sounds. But look, none of this is good news. If you are the Liberal Party and you were looking at one province as a place where you had some high ground to hold on to, and you're seeing that slip away, we saw Mr. Trudeau in the English debate. He was largely silent. He was largely on the sidelines. He cannot afford a repeat of that performance tonight if they hope to be able to reshift and retake momentum from the Bloc, which, as Eric has pointed out, has been just incrementally surging and gaining since the beginning of the campaign. For the Conservative Party, of course, there's always pressure on them to be able to pick up. You always want to pick up, not just hold on to what you've got. That's the point of trying to win an election. But I think the stakes are a little bit higher for the Liberals in this case. The Conservatives always are able to hold on to the rock-solid voting base that they have, particularly in Ontario, where they're starting to look a little bit better. But of course, that's not going to be enough. It's not going to be a path to victory. So Quebec continues to be a place where both parties need to make gains, and that means both parties need to take down the Bloc tonight.
Let me circle back to what you were talking about with Jagmeet Singh and Eric, the numbers, those new numbers from Angus Reid that Shachi is pointing to. The headline asks the question of whether the NDP momentum will solidify or not. What factors will you be looking at to determine whether that will be the case, Eric?
Well, to see if we do have the NDP going up in the polls and holding those numbers. We did see in the Angus Reid poll, in the Léger poll, an uptick for the NDP in two areas, which is more respectable for the party, into the mid to high teens, rather in the mid to low teens. But it's whether they'll be able to sustain it. And if we do get into a scenario where next week we're talking about the potential for the Conservatives to win, if the New Democratic voting base stays with the Liberals or not, because the polling does suggest that New Democrats and Greens are more concerned about a return of the Conservatives to power than a re-election for Justin Trudeau. So for Jagmeet Singh, not as much, I would say, at stake in this debate. I think he has improved his party's prospects in the province a little bit based on the last couple of weeks. So for tonight, it's just about whether he can then make sure that he doesn't lose those incremental gains, because if some of the other parties are dropping, it might increase the chances for the New Democrats to hold on to some of those seats where the incumbents are well placed. But if he has a bad performance tonight, then I think they have to start worrying again about those 1 or 2 or 3 holdouts in the province that maybe today might get reelected, but might not tomorrow if things are looking not as good.
Shachi, when you look to that question of whether or not the momentum can be solidified, what are you looking for?
I'm looking at a lot of issues, Vashi. First of all, we're seeing that momentum come up on the backs of young voters, those magical unicorns of 18 to 34-year-old voters who in 2015 surged and rallied around Justin Trudeau. Now they're really liking what they saw in Jagmeet Singh, rallying around him. We're seeing his favorability numbers really pick up with both men and women aged 18 to 34. But we all know that this is the one cohort, the one demographic that does not have a traditional and historical pattern of voting in elections. Yes, they showed up in 2015. Will they show up in 2019? Then there's the strategic voting and the second choice factor. So when we look at vote certainty, again, we're seeing that rock solid base of conservative voters who say, absolutely, I'm not going to change my mind. You're increasingly seeing more liberal voters saying, I'm not going to change my mind. But the potential for changing your mind among NDP and Green voters continues to be massive. So you look at that, you look at second choice, and ultimately when you ask the question of soft voters who could still change their mind and sit on the center left, what's the likelihood that you might just switch and vote for the Liberals at the end of the day? You see a significant number of them saying, yeah, I could if it came down to blocking a party or a government that I didn't want to see, namely the Conservatives, versus supporting a party that maybe I don't like, but is closer in line to my values. And you ask the question of voters today, what would you like to see? A conservative majority, a conservative minority, or one of those two options on the Liberal side? Look, the conservative base absolutely on the strength of it says we would like to see a conservative majority. That represents about 34% of the population, but everyone else is split largely between seeing and wanting to see either a Liberal or a majority or a Liberal minority. So again, those vote dynamics on the left of center, very jiggly, very mushy, and have yet to lock in. And we just, with 10 days to go, are not necessarily seeing any sign that they have finished moving around. And you could see that happening, very late in the campaign, depending on what happens next.
How do you anticipate, Eric, that those mushy dynamics on the left that Shachi alludes to, how do you anticipate that might affect the messaging, particularly from the Liberals heading into these last 10 days?
Well, Justin Trudeau has been trying to make this election as a choice between his government and a Conservative government. So I think we're going to keep hearing that, and pretty loudly, from Justin Trudeau, because it's the old playbook for the Liberals that they try to get those NDP voters and Green voters to go back into the Liberal fold to block a Conservative government. So I think that is what absolutely we're going to be hearing from Justin Trudeau. And we're already starting to hear some of the other leaders more or less positioned themselves for afterwards. Jagmeet Singh giving his conditions for supporting a government. Elizabeth May has always wanted to have a minority government where the Greens would hold the balance of power. And even Yves-François Blanchet has been making the case that send enough blocistes to the House of Commons and we can hold the balance of power. So I think that we're going to keep hearing those parties that have that potential to hold the balance of power to talk about, don't waste your vote on a Liberal or Conservative, elect us and we can have a minority government. Whereas Justin Trudeau is the complete opposite message. So those two are going to be clashing.
Shachi, final question to you. 10 days to go, as we've been saying throughout this. You know, if you could help our viewers understand what exactly you'll be looking for in those 10 days, what would you say?
Turnout, 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 turnout. Advanced voting starts tomorrow. I think that's going to be an interesting indication of who's showing up. Now, the question is always who shows up early, who shows up late. But, you know, we saw 4 years ago keen voters across all age demographics showing up in those advance polls to be counted. If we are only seeing older voters and older demographics showing up, I think that is a sign that across the left of center spectrum, the parties really have to be starting to look at mobilizing their vote, and they're trying to do that while at the same time trying to pull together or coalesce their votes. So that is something, again, that is going to be the story of this election. Where do the young people go? And once they've decided to do something, if they decide to do something, will they actually show up or will they stay home? And the Liberals are in a tricky position right now. This is a time where mistakes can be made, unforced errors can happen. They have to somehow walk the line between not being too negative in calling out their opponents and trying to make the case for themselves, and at the same time exhorting that base to look at them as the only option. And the thing is that those two things don't always go together so well, because we know that negative campaigns can have the effect of turning people off. When people are turned off, they stay home. If they stay home, that's bad news again for this incumbent government.
You've given us a lot to watch for tonight. Thank you to both of you. Thanks to Shachi Kurl of the Angus Reid Institute, and of course our own Eric Grenier. 38 minutes to go. The countdown is on. We're here at the Museum of History, counting down to the French language debate, the final debate of this election campaign. The power panel will be here after a quick commercial break to weigh in. We're going to talk about the stakes and the strategies ahead of that debate. Stay with us.
One at a time, Mr. Singh.
But life is getting more expensive.
Mr. Singh and then Mr. Bain.
I want to say this directly to Canadians. You do not need to choose between Mr. Delay and Mr. Deny. There is another option.
Andrew, you are calling yourself a conservative, but you don't want to balance the budget in 2 years. You will have $70 billion on our debt.
Keep your promises. From the Rockies to the Bay of Fundy, Conservative premiers have gotten elected on promises to do nothing on climate change, and we need a strong federal government to fight them, to make sure that we are moving forward on protecting the future generations from the impacts of climate change.
So there is a vacancy for the Ontario Liberal leadership, and if you're so focused on provincial politics, go and run for the leadership of that party, Mr. Trudeau.
What you are doing, Mr. Scheer, is playing this old card. You're trading the idea that Quebec is corrupt.
No, that
Those
is not
3,400 people have done nothing wrong. Now the value of the shares are going down.
We will never allow a single inch of retreat from the hard-earned rights of women in this country. Not 1 inch.
This is...
We can identify certain debates that have had an impact on the bottom line of vote intention. Most debates, most of the time, however, don't have discernible impact.
That's Richard Johnston. He's a political scientist at the University of British Columbia.
Be serious.
Johnston says the 1988 debate is a rare example of when a debate can change the outcome of an election. He says this exchange became the pivotal moment of the campaign.
I happen to believe that you've sold us out.
John Turner was behind in the polls, but During the debate, he stepped toward Brian Mulroney and questioned him on the government's free trade agreement with the United States.
Once a country yields its energy.
We have not done it.
Once a country yields its agriculture.
Wrong
Once
again.
a country opens itself up to a subsidy war with the United States
Wrong
on
again.
terms of definition, then the political ability of this country to sustain the influence of the United States, to remain as an independent nation, that is lost forever, and that's the issue of this election.
Mr. Turner.
The PCs still won the election, but according to this paper in the British Journal of Political Science, the debate had a substantial and enduring impact on the vote. The Liberals gained at the expense of both the Conservatives and the NDP.
Debates are very difficult on incumbents. They tend to be attacked by all sides, and they have something to defend. Nobody else really has much to defend.
This is David Hurley. He chaired several Liberal campaigns in the early 2000s. Leaders who aren't as well known and challengers often have the most to gain. According to this study in the 1988 debates, it was the party out of power who benefited the most. 4 years earlier, things were entirely different. Turner was the incumbent then. Mulroney went at him for carrying out his predecessor's partisan appointments.
Well, I've told you and told the Canadian people, Mr. Mulroney, that I had no option.
You had an option, sir, to say no, and you chose to say yes to the old attitudes and the old stories of the Liberal Party.
That Mulroney moment, every time I want inspiration about a debate, I watch that moment because it's just so devastating.
This is Jason Leader. He managed the war room for the Conservative Party during the 2011 campaign.
Mr. Mulroney just went at him with both barrels and, essentially sunk the campaign.
The most devastating blows often happen when the target isn't prepared for the shot. Remember this debate? In 2011, Jack Layton asked how Michael Ignatieff could expect to become Prime Minister based on his attendance record in the House.
Most Canadians, if they don't show up for work, they don't get a promotion.
We were prepared for that night. We knew that Mr. Ignatieff wasn't fast on his feet.
It was devastating because you could see Mr. Ignatieff was like, holy crap, I didn't see that coming.
Welcome back to a very special extended debate day edition of Power and Politics, coming to you from the site of the final leaders debate of this campaign, the Museum of History over in Quebec. In just over half an hour, 33 minutes, 6 party leaders will go head to head in French, and CBC News Network will of course bring you that debate with full translation, so stay tuned for that, to break down the party strategies heading into the debate and look at what impact or the potential impact that debate has. We've convened our power panel. Hill and Knowlton Strategies' Melissa Landsman joins us from Toronto, and here with me in our so-called studio, I guess, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister Yolande James, political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin is right next to her, and Le Devoir's Marie Vastel. Hi, everybody. We're here for the duration for the next 33 minutes. I wanted to actually play on or pick up on some of the experience that you guys have in preparing for debates. I know I'll start with you, Melissa, because I know that you have been involved in debate prep and mock debates. What kind of things, if you could help our viewers understand, pull back the curtain a bit into what you imagine has been happening over the last 12 to 24 hours behind the scenes for the parties as they prepare for tonight?
Sure. The last 12 or 24 hours are very different than what debate prep entails. Lots of people think that it's sort of fun. It's actually not, really. There's a lot of sort of book work, creating the binder, making sure that everybody is okay on the policy front of what the leader is going to say to all of the questions. In the last 12 to 24 hours, you would see something like mock debates, and that's when teams try to recreate the exact thing that the candidate is going to feel on stage. So that's where everybody's standing. You've got usually people close to the leader playing the roles of the other leaders, and they spend lots of time looking at tape, making sure that they can get into character and making sure that they can stave off the attacks that they might feel on the stage. So 2 very different processes. One of them certainly more fun than the other, but it's the job of the debate team is really to get the leader ready. And if the debate prep is not harder than the actual debate, I think the debate team hasn't done its job.
By the way, for those of you who are watching us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, you can definitely send in your questions, because over the next half hour, we'll also be asking the power panelists or getting to as many of those questions as possible. You just post them in the comment section, and I'll ask them on your behalf. Françoise, you participated in many debates. What's it like from that perspective?
Well, I wouldn't like to be one of those leaders that Melissa described because for me, what was important, and I appreciate it from my team, was that they let me be a bit. It's very important to not stress out your candidate. Yeah. And I felt a difference in my preparation between 2011 and 2015. 2011, I was not the MP, so I was fighting somebody to oust somebody from their seat. In 2015, everybody came after me. So it's two different preparations. So I think the team should not look at a handy book on how debate goes, but adapt it to their own situation. Where is their leader at this point in time? What's their forte? What's their weakness? Try to not work so much the weakness that the candidate becomes so not at ease. You can freeze a candidate sometimes that is so afraid of doing a mistake. Let them, I mean, they're not leader for nothing. They won debates before against other people in their party. So I hope they all had time to relax in any way that they relax, whatever, and that they can come out and realize and break down the 2 hours by the number of minutes that they will actually be on stage. And once you realize that, you know that you don't have to perform that well for that long. So I hope they didn't over-prepare them.
It's interesting because you echo what a lot of people have said, and that is, Yolande, that confidence in the way in which, substance is, of course, extremely important, but the way in which you come across, the ease with which you conduct yourself in a debate can really make a lot of difference. We had former premiers Bob Rae and Christy Clark on yesterday. Bob Rae said that he would go golfing in the afternoon before. Christy Clark said that she would write on a piece of paper, have fun, and that's what would be in front of her on her podium, because she was like, it is fun. It's not, it's not that. How important do you think is the way in which people come across, these leaders come across?
Because I think authenticity doesn't lie, and as much as especially it's a televised debate, as much as we try to prepare lines and you want to get your message through, and every party and every party leader is genuine about that, in the end, the citizen is very much able to see when you're being real or when you are just passing a line, or a message. So your authenticity in the way that you present yourself really matters, and you can't really prep for that. There is a lot of preparation involved, and you have to do that, and that is part of the confidence, obviously. But at a certain point, you have to just let it go. And the experience that you have debating, you do get better at it. I think of an Elizabeth May who's done this before, and a Justin Trudeau's done this before. Obviously, there has to be a certain, not comfort, there's stress. You've been in the surroundings. You understand what's happening. When it's your first time, it's a lot more stressful. And I have so much respect for all of them. And I say this every time because, I know that all the leaders are very conscious of the fact that they have 337 candidates that are looking to them in their campaign teams, watching the night and knowing how important that night is for them, and they want to pull through for their team. So you got to prep and just understand, let it go, and have the people around you that are going to be best for you in those moments. You don't want that person going, are you okay? Like, that's the worst, probably.
Marie, and it's interesting that that idea of authenticity seemed to really set, for example, and we've been talking about it throughout the show, but Jagmeet Singh apart. I listened very closely to the substance of everything that he said and other leaders said. There wasn't actually a lot different in what he said than what we've heard throughout the campaign, prior to the campaign. It was this sort of sense that he kept sort of separating himself, and he just seemed real, I think, is what people keep telling me. I don't know if I'm the best judge, but other people keep telling me that.
Yeah, I agree. And people keep telling me that what they didn't like was when, as Yolande just said, it sounded rehearsed, and when they were just repeating their lines, which Jagmeet Singh also did with his corporate, helping the corporate and not helping the real people, and they all have their lines that they're going to repeat today and that we've been hearing for 30 days. But it is true, I think, that people pick up on that. I think the challenge is, as Yolande said, and this, especially this, because it's the last debate, it's like your ultimate chance to seal the deal for your party. And so I'm sure they want to feel genuine and authentic and relaxed and go golfing like Bob, but I can only imagine how stressed out you are. Like, I couldn't do it. I can only imagine how stressed out you are, that all these people are looking at me, and it's the ultimate ultimate verdict on your campaign. Good luck to the leaders.
It's how I felt the first month of the show every single night before. Just like I was going to throw up.
Not a good idea.
I'm going to press pause on Power Panel, but as I said, you're sticking with us throughout the next half hour. 26 minutes to go until the debate begins. You're watching Power and Politics, a special edition of Power and Politics on CBC News Network. We're back in a moment.
You know, most Canadians, if they don't show up for work, they don't get a promotion.
See, Mr. Ignatieff was like, holy crap, I didn't see that coming.
And as soon as the debate ended, there was an ad on television with the same message.
Indy had the worst attendance record of all 308 members of Parliament. Not so great leadership.
So that was obviously completely coordinated and planned.
A spike in support for the NDP happened around the time of the debates, though there were other factors at play too. Those moments are what every strategist is hoping for. And that's why they say debate prep is absolutely critical.
Debate prep is like going and sitting in the dentist chair for a few hours, and I gotta tell you, nobody likes to do it.
Strategy is key. A few people are usually solely assigned to debate prep, and they will study the leaders, their strengths, their weaknesses, what topics might get under their skin. And then they'll prep a debate book filled with facts, rebuttals, and zingers. And then you have the mock debates. To give you an idea, this leaked video from Hillary Clinton's 2016 debate prep shows her campaign manager playing the role of Donald Trump. Clinton was practicing how to avoid a hug.
So you've got to make sure that you've got role players who are believable, and they've got to do a lot of preparation as well. That's the other thing, is if they're unprepared, debate prep stinks.
Many view the 1960 Nixon-Kennedy presidential debates as a lesson in why appearance can also be key. Nixon had been ill, and he stood out next to Kennedy, who appeared healthy.
Research indicated that people who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon won, and people who watched the debate on television thought that Kennedy won.
Some teams even hire body language experts to help leaders who might have physical habits or verbal tics that could cause problems.
Mostly you want them to be comfortable. What an incredibly stressful, high-stakes moment that hour and a half is for those leaders.
Leader says he ran dial groups that showed people were turned off when exchanges became really negative and leaders spoke over each other.
Whenever people start shouting at each other or shouting over each other, dial goes down. Like, people hate it. So you've got to prepare your people in a way that says, do not be shouting over each other.
Even if there's no consensus on the effect debates have, experts do agree that they're good for the political process.
Debates level the playing field in a way and allow parties who are maybe second, third, fourth, fifth tier to have an opportunity to engage with the leaders at the same level.
Think about it like this. It's the only time you'll ever really see the leaders all together during the campaign interacting and actually talking policy.
If you didn't have debates, then really all you would have is the even stagier and even more fake world of advertising, leaders' tours, and public appearances designed to create positive impressions.
Welcome back. You're watching a special extended edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Capellos. We're coming to you from the Museum of History over in Gatineau, Quebec. There is a shot inside, some images from inside the room in which the French language leaders debate, the last debate of this federal election campaign, will take place in just about 22 minutes. We're coming to you, of course, on CBC News Network, as well as on CBC Gem, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm standing by with the Power Panel, and we are going to take your questions, send them in wherever you're watching. Just post your question on the comment section, and our Power Panel will aim to answer it over the next 22 minutes. I'm here with Melissa Lantzman, Marie Vastel, Yolande James, and Françoise Boivin. Melissa, why don't I start with you? Picking up with that scene inside gave me some deja vu from a few days ago on Monday, and the format of that debate ended up being quite a topic of conversation in the hours and the days that followed the debate. We have a question on Instagram we got from Tina Burgess. Is there any way they could stop talking over one another? The format in this debate is a little bit different. There will be a question from a Canadian. It is divided into 5 segments, which is kind of similar to before, but there is more time essentially for 3 of the candidates to debate each other than another 3, so more kind of open debate. Do you anticipate that it'll run into the same issues that many people perceive watching the one on Monday night?
I think the one on Monday night had a lot to do with the moderators, and not any moderator particularly, because I think they did the best they could with what circumstances they had. But when you change moderators in the middle of the debate, you change the pacing of the debate, you change sort of how leaders interact with each other, and it's incredibly difficult to prepare for when you can't find that one person to play the moderator in any way that would look like that night. So hopefully this format is better, because what was really sad is the Canadians really lost out on that night when we spent most of the next 24 hours talking about the format and how badly it was and how poorly the commission set that debate up, rather than any sort of policy or any issues that Canadians would have cared about. That debate gave room for basically like a digital like graphic type win, where I'm saying it sort of gave way to the one-liners with no real follow-up question, and hopefully people can spar a bit more today and really kind of dive deep into what they want Canadians to know about their party.
That's a really interesting point, Marie, the idea, and that is true of the coverage after and the analysis after. I mean, you saw very much a focus on the lines that were able to be delivered free from the obstruction or the idea of people talking over each other, right? Like the clearly delivered lines ended up being picked up and then put out there for people to grasp. And that is the impression that a lot of people, I imagine, were left with. It's hard to avoid that, though, I think, with 6 people on the stage.
Well, and what's interesting is I was chatting with the campaigns this afternoon ahead of the debate, and one of the campaigns, I won't say who, suspected another of the campaigns, won't say who, of deliberately,
no, you should say who,
deliberately talking over their leader in order to ruin that clip. And so to go back to your questioner's question, I think that's on purpose, because they're essentially trying, if they feel like there's an attack coming and there's a few jabs coming, they're just going to talk all over him to make sure that that doesn't end up being the social media clip that plays all along. Otherwise, Melissa's right. Essentially, in this day and age, and even on the news, actually, they'll just play the good exchanges between the two leaders, those clips where they both went at each other, or one of them had a really good attack line on another one, and then that's kind of what you take away from the debate, right?
Well, it's like a function of logistics. I'll be transparent. I would like to play a clip that people can understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
If they're all shouting over each other, I mean, it illustrates the point that that's the form the debate took, but at the same time, if we're going to be discussing something specific that was said, I need for the viewers to be able to hear it, right? And clearly strategists and people organizing this have that, are aware.
They have that in mind, and they know from the topic and the theme that they might be a target on that issue. But maybe because of the fact for a lot of the leaders, it's their second language, kind of hard if you're not used to debating in a language to come out and come with an attack, as in it's like, okay, what are you going to say exactly? So maybe in the exchanges where there are leaders in their second language, it'll allow for a lot more slower pace in a sense, so they can take their time to kind of say what they have to say. I think that's going to be actually really important for Andrew Scheer. I found Jagmeet Singh did so really well in French. He really impressed a lot of people with his level of French in his debate, Jagmeet Singh. And for Andrew Scheer, if he could just kind of maybe take his time and break it down to short sentences to get his message across, maybe I'll have a better shot at it than he did.
It seemed like the format, the format at the TVA debate, though, was generally lauded. Like, people seemed to say there was more. It seems like the key is the idea of open debate between the leaders, and that it's somewhat to Melissa's point, that it's somewhat moderated, right? Like that there's 3 and 3, not all 6.
Forget there were just 4.
Yeah.
So that makes a big difference. There were 6 people on the stage. Everybody is vying for their little minutes. I said divide 2 hours by 6 leaders. It tells you how much time they have.
20 minutes.
They have their team. We just talk about the preparation, saying you have to land this line, this line, this line, and this line. You have the attack.
Seconds.
You might be attacked on this. You have to answer this. And then somebody just throws you off balance by talking on top of you. They'll always, I'm sad to say to your viewer, that it is really annoying. In my living room, I stop the sound. I just can't stand it. And I look at their behavior, just the nonverbal and so on. But that's what these guys do all the time in the House of Commons. They talk on top of each other, so they won't be less rude when they're in a debate. And don't forget that their team probably said, don't let anyone take advantage on you, because then you look like you're a carpet that everybody can stand on and stomp on. So they have all these things. They look calm. Just look at their face, but they're thinking of all these concept, and they try to land punches.
But as you said, the TVA debate was a bit more open in terms of exchanges and debates. And tonight, since there are
face-to-face.
Tonight, since there are trios instead of only one-on-ones, hopefully we'll see a little bit more of that.
And there's one moderator as well, to Melissa's point.
That's a big
final question to you, Melissa. Faim Qbal, and I apologize if I'm saying that wrong, from Instagram asks, and this goes to the point that everyone was making, do zingers affect the way the debate goes? And I think talking there also about the idea of landing this so-called elusive knockout punch. Does that kind of thing factor into the way in which the trajectory that a debate can take?
Yeah, of course. It's part of the strategy. You want to get that clip for social media in a digital-first world that we're living in now. But if you're over-focused on that knockout punch, you're not practicing everything else. I think you generally have a page in your binder which is full of zingers, and if the opportunity arises, or if you can create the opportunity to use it, that's great. You can pump it out to your supporters. You can raise money off of it. You can put lawn signs in people's lawns off of it, and it makes its way into the stories and the headlines the next day, particularly in a French debate where I think much of English Canada won't be watching, and they'll look for the analysis afterwards. So the zingers are important, but they rarely happen. So staking your entire strategy on it, not such a great idea.
You brought up a good point of conversation, the idea of English Canada and how they'll be perceiving this. There's 14 minutes or just under 15 minutes left to go until this debate. We have a great question from Facebook. James Casey asks, how much of an impact will this debate have on the election outside of Quebec? It's such a good question that I'm going to make you wait 2 minutes to hear the answer. The Power Panel will answer that right after this quick commercial break. Stay with us.
The science is clear. Your target is a commitment to failure. That's why it's so doable and achievable, because it doesn't do what the IPCC says we must do. We must go off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And you bought a pipeline. You can't be a climate leader and spend $10 to $13 billion more on a project that by itself blows through our carbon budget. We have to actually
a slogan is not a plan.
No, we have a plan.
A slogan is not a plan. It is an unrealizable plan. Canadians need that action that is going to actually make us better, fight climate change, protect the environment, and build a stronger economy for our kids. That's what we have done more over the past 4 years than any government in the history of Canada. And there is much more to do. There is much more to do.
No one remembers Paul Martin's plan in 2005. It was better. But the reality is, if you have
over the past 4 years, we delivered on it.
If you have a fire in a 4-story building, getting a 1-story ladder doesn't do it.
That is completely false. And just because you say something over and over and over again doesn't make it true. There's no
nice
Canadian.
For you to learn
there's
that,
no
Mr. Scheer.
Canadian. There's no Canadian that believes that they're going to be better off by paying a carbon tax. You have given a massive exemption to the country's largest polluters, and your plan is already
the experts,
failing.
the Parliament.
I want to say this directly to Canadians. You do not need to choose between Mr. Delay and Mr. Deny. There is another option. There is another option out there. We are committed to a real plan that's going to take on the biggest polluters. It's going to take on the powerful interests, because that's what we need to do. If we want to build a better future,
what is your target?
It's going to mean taking on the powerful. That means we're going to have to cut our emissions by more than half.
But you need to have a plan that is rooted in a target that saves our kids' future.
People must know that Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau, you're the same on climate change. You want to impose a carbon tax on Canadians, and you want to impose more costly regulation.
I think that's the most offensive thing you've said all night, Max, that we're the same on climate change.
You want to impose also a big tax on the big emitters. So you're the same on climate change, and you won't be able to achieve your target.
I think the goal should be down to almost nothing.
Yes.
Not 13, not 16, not almost nothing. And what do you think about this idea of an equalization based on gas emissions? Those who are over the average emissions of Canada pay, and those who are under the average emissions get the money. The incentive is for both parts.
What we have to do is work together, and with all due respect, that was the question I asked Mr. Trudeau. Are any of you prepared to accept the notion of changing status quo decision-making so we form an internal cabinet?
My only requirement
the principle of that.
My only requirement is that I would not work with conservatives.
That is good.
Okay,
that's all.
Does
not help.
Hi there, you're watching a special extended edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Kapelos, and I'm standing here with the Power Panel. We're coming to you on CBC News Network, CBC Gem, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We are on site, just 11 minutes to go for the final leaders debate of this campaign. This one happens to be in French. It's taking place at the Museum of History over in Gatineau, the same place where on Monday the English language debate happened. Melissa, I'll pick up with you. This is the question we asked before the break. It came from James Casey on Facebook. How much of an impact will this debate have on the election outside of Quebec?
Well, I think for debate night itself, not much. I'm not sure that much of English Canada will be watching in depth. I think the coverage, though, depending on what happens, and you leave a lot in the hands of live TV. The coverage of what happens might play a role. It sort of depends if we're discussing energy or Bill 21, which is sort of the conversations have permeated outside of Quebec, and if any leader sort of is magical in it, that'll end up on a front page somewhere. Or if any leader is absolutely terrible, that might also end up hurting them outside of Quebec. But I think the answer is not really.
Françoise, I imagine those issues that Melissa points to that have the potential to break through into coverage outside of Quebec involve issues, are issues really where there's a contrast between the position Quebecers have taken on it, and the position the rest of Canada, or a majority of the rest of Canada has taken on it. And she points to a couple of those issues. Do you think that would be the case tonight, or what makes it translate to English Canada?
Yeah, well, my jury is still out on it, because it's one thing of what the media are talking about. We're all saying about Bill 21, but I'm not so sure that Canadians are on the same page totally than the media on the actual topic. I think Canadians are tired of that topic, because that's something that at least pretty much everybody agrees. It's in Quebec. Quebec's decided on it. It's in front of the courts. We'll let the court do their thing, and we'll see.
Although there are some leaders outside, like Mayor Nahedanchi, who are making it, who are saying we should be talking about it.
I take your point. We have to, this election, if election 43 is only about Bill 21, believe you me, I'm going into the river right after this panel. There's so many other things. We're talking, there's a little R that nobody is really talking about, recession. Not to depress people more than with Bill 21, but at some point in time, we have to have people at the helm that will do other things to make sure that they manage our money well. It's hundreds of billions of dollars. We're talking about climate emergency. Whatever people say, it's not urgent. There are some measures to take. We bought, all Canadians are now proud owner of a pipeline. What do we do with it? So many other good questions.
Sometimes campaigns do come down to like the niqab in 2015.
Well, it's kind of sad in my book, having been a victim of the niqab. It's kind of sad, because in a lot of aspects, and I think this election though will be different. We'll see a very free elector to go pretty much wherever they want to go.
Doesn't seem like there is that one issue yet.
And I don't think many of them will be in Quebec next week. I think it'll be interesting to see how many leaders go back to Quebec next week. I think they have a lot of things to do in the West, in BC, in Atlantic Canada, in Ontario.
But it's interesting, because from the beginning of the campaign, I think a lot of us kind of struggled to kind of say, well, what's a ballot question? What's a ballot question? What's a ballot question? And we certainly knew Bill 21 would be there. We've mentioned the fact that it took, with the Premier of Quebec, a lot more space. But it's so, I share Françoise's kind of shock in the sense that for me, I don't know why we're not remembering that the fate of Bill 21 does not lie in the hands of federal leaders. It lies in the hands of the courts right now. So it's not to minimize how people feel about it and the emotion of it, but in terms of the political result of it, it's actually a judicial one right now.
I think that logistically that matters, but politically the question has been put to them because it forces them to articulate a position, and they haven't.
Sure,
right? They're trying to play both sides.
Sure. Well, I mean, people could not be satisfied with their position and not clarified it enough. That's fine. But once it's been there, I mean, there has to be also other topics that would be a point of it. As for other people outside of Quebec, I guess I'm not the right person to talk about that. But if I were them, or talking to my family outside of them.
Quickly, I just want to point out to our viewers, those are the moderators there. They're just,
there's
kind of a cycling through right now of various people who are involved in the debate and some, we call them photo ops, as you can see. So the moderators will be there and then the leaders will follow in a few minutes. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So I would kind of feel like my election is being hijacked by Quebec.
Exactly.
If I'm out west or I'm in Atlantic, I think my issues matter as well, and I would like to be able to hear what's happening. So, in terms of the federation, I find it's been a very Quebec-centric federal election campain. So thank you to François Legault with respect to that. So I'm thinking people will follow the debate on the debate, because there was always a debate on how people did afterwards, and it does have an effect, because we saw the French language debate when Andrew Scheer was at the front page of a very read
both debates so far.
On the front page of a newspaper, exactly, sorry, saying that he did poorly, and a lot of people retweeted that. That did also have an impact negatively on the polls for them. So it is important.
Marie, final word to you.
I think the impact in the rest of Canada is on narrative, is on who did well, who did bad, because that does percolate. Even if you didn't follow the debate closely, it does percolate in people's minds. There's still 10 days until the voting day, unless you're voting advanced polling, but for the rest of people. And so it can still, I think, cement the way you wanted to vote or make you change your mind. Also because no one wants to vote for a loser. And so if one of them did poorly, and that's what people keep saying, that they're doing poorly in the polls, I think that might make people think twice about their vote. And to go back to the fact that, yes, it was actually a very Quebec centrist election, and that it might bother people in the rest of Canada. I think what is said tonight in that room, in that museum, will be interesting to see if they get themselves into trouble by trying to court Quebec voters, by trying to court Francophone voters. Do they say something that perhaps bothers voters outside of Quebec on pipelines, on Quebec's autonomy to decide on a number of things like immigration, on Bill 21? I think you're right that Bill 21 shouldn't be a federal issue, but I think on Bill 21, on the NICAB in 2015, I think those are things where people look at the leaders and wonder, what is their leadership? What are they willing to do to stand up for their principles, to stand up for their Charter of Rights and Freedoms? And I think that's how they judge the leaders, on how they position themselves on issues like that.
And there come those leaders right now. I should mention that if you are outside of Quebec and you want to watch this debate, we're carrying it live in just under 4 minutes on CBC News Network, and we will have a fully translated debate. There are the leaders coming up to the podiums right now, I believe, for a photo op. We've got Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, Elizabeth May, Green Party leader Elizabeth May, as well as NDP leader Jagmeet Singh there. The positioning is also interesting. Of course, it seemed to affect a lot of the dynamics in the debate on Monday night, and who ended up talking over whom and who was facing off against who. And you have to wonder how that might affect the event tonight, the debate tonight. We are, of course, just over 3 minutes away. I have time for a final thought from each of you as we look towards this debate. One thing you're watching for, 3 minutes to go. One thing you'll be watching for tonight. Melissa?
Oh, certainly watching for the one leader that can actually, frankly, speak to Quebecers. I think this debate has much importance in Quebec and not so much outside of Quebec, other than coverage. So we'll see who actually speaks to Quebecers about what they want, and it's really nothing more than that.
Françoise?
Pretty much the same, and I'll see if Andrew Scheer comes up lively a bit tonight, is mostly what I'm going to look at. And if Yves-François Blanchet being a bit more attacked, what type of reaction he's gonna get. I see the crowd was very lively toward Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Scheer, so we'll see how the crowd reacts also, even though we say you're not supposed to applaud.
Yeah, that was interesting. I was actually surprised to hear
it was fascinating to hear the big
applause,
for those two big leaders, and not so much for the others, maybe because they didn't fill the room, less organizations.
I'm going to be watching to see if Justin Trudeau takes the opportunity to reconnect with Quebecers with a direct message, and essentially if Yves-François Blanchet can take the heat, because he's going to be under some spotlight tonight.
Marie?
Yeah, I think I'll look to who's more comfortable. Some of them were not comfortable in the TVA debate, partly because of language. Who's more comfortable and is able to, as Melissa said, get their points across, present their platforms, because some people still don't know which party offers what, but also is able to try and stop their opponent's momentums.
Okay, thank you very much to the Power Panel. You've been wonderful. Thanks for sticking with us for 3 whole hours. Very much appreciate it. Thanks to Melissa Lantzman, Marie Vastel, Yolande James, and Françoise Boivin. I should note, we're just over a minute away. They will all join me again, or for the most part, Marie has to work and file for her stories, but, well, we're still working, but they will all join me after the debate at 10 o'clock Eastern, where we will offer you analysis about what happened, and we'll also, of course, carry the scrums, so the chance that all the leaders have following the debate to address reporters. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes. After that, we'll take all of those live to you as well. Once again, you have been watching an extended edition of Power and Politics from the Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. You're looking right now inside the museum. That is where the French language official debate will take place. This is the last debate, the last time all 6 federal party leaders will be able to face off against each other in this election campaign, and it is a close campaign. In fact, the 2 lead parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, have been virtually tied since day one 4 weeks ago. And in Quebec, very much where much of this debate is aimed, a different picture. The Bloc Québécois in recent weeks has seen a resurgence. How will that factor into tonight's debate? That's what you're staying tuned for. 10 seconds left. We'll see you right after the debate here on CBC News Network. This has been Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Kapelos.
Le compte à rebours est officiellement lancé.
Allô tout le monde! On a le plan pour poursuivre notre lancée. Avec moi.
C'est seulement le Parti conservateur qui peut remplacer Justin Trudeau.
Hey, wow! We're gonna do this!
Qui pouvait se battre pour vous? C'est l'NPD.
Si vous m'accordez votre confiance, jamais vous n'aurez à le regretter.
Nous sommes prêts!
Le vote avec le plus de pouvoir, c'est un vote vert.
Les autres partis ont de bonnes raisons d'avoir peur de nous.
Les Canadiens vont faire un choix. Quelle direction ils veulent prendre pour le pays?
En direct du Musée canadien de l'histoire à Gatineau,
the Canadian Debate Production Partnership presents the Leaders Debate 2019. Here's Patrice Roy. Good evening. Welcome to the Federal Leaders Debate. Ladies and gentlemen, leaders, welcome. Good evening.
Good evening.
There was a draw to determine your podium positions and speaking order. 5 themes will be covered this evening. Each theme will be launched by a question from a Canadian live. After responses from leaders, there will be 2 three-way debates, then rapid-fire questions from a guest journalist. This debate will be followed by Canadians here at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, and we'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here with us tonight. And there'll be gatherings across the country. This is the last debate of this campaign, as you know, and I'm counting on you, leaders, to give us clear answers. And most of all, to not all speak at the same time. And I will see to this. And sometimes you will see on the screen the cumulative speaking times of the speakers. Enjoy the debate, ladies and gentlemen. Environment and energy. And we're going to start this theme in Trois-Rivières this evening with a question from Elizabeth Darvaux. Ms. Darvaux, good evening.
Good evening.
Darvaux, the leaders are listening to you. Tell us your question.
In an era where we are increasingly concerned with the environment and where the UN has declared a climate emergency, it has become essential that we do what it takes to counter this crisis. My question is as follows. Knowing that if we do not act now, we will reach the point of no return. So, what is the first concrete thing you will do to fight climate change?
Thank you very much, Ms. Darvaux. First person to answer, Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your question. Well, it's a question that we're hearing from across the country. We've heard it as we've crossed the country, and people are telling us that the future of their children, the future of the environment, the fight against climate change is essential. And we have done a lot in the last 4 years, but we have to continue to move forward. And we need to stand up to conservatives like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford and the oil barons who are supporting them to continue to fight against climate change and build a better world. That is why the choice that you're making tonight is so important. And I trust Canadians. I trust that we will move forward together.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Bernier.
Good evening. The other parties will tell you that they will meet the targets under the Paris Accord, but they will not be able to reach them because they'd have to impose a tax on carbon to the tune of 300 tons. And they can't do that. They say they're going to save the world, save our climate. But as you know, Canada's global carbon emissions only amount to 2% of the total world emissions. So in the People's Party of Canada, we want to take concrete steps so that our water and our air are free of pollution. We need to take honest steps to protect our environment and not be hypocritical like the other leaders here are on the stage regarding climate change. They don't have a solution.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's a huge issue. I know that in Quebec there has been severe flooding. There have been forest fires. It's a real fight we're dealing with now. What we're proposing now is not to purchase a pipeline like Mr. Trudeau did. We want to end subsidies to the oil patch. That's a step we're willing to take immediately, and we want to reinvest that money in renewable energy, clean energy, and we want to invest massively in public transit. There are things we can do. It's just a question of having the courage, and we have that courage.
Mr. Scheer.
Yes, the environment is one of the pillars of this campaign, and as a father of 5 children, I want to make sure that the next generation will have a cleaner environment than that which we inherited ourselves. Contrary to what Mr. Trudeau claims on this file, his plan is a failure. One of the first decisions he made as Prime Minister was to authorize 8 billion litres of wastewater to be spilled into our rivers. We will end this because we are now in 2019.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scheer. Mr. Blanchet.
Good evening. Thank you for welcoming us tonight. There are definitely many measures that can be undertaken. Let me mention a few of these. I think that Parliament should, through a law, as Mr. Singh said, we should stop subsidizing big oil. We're talking about $10 billion a year based on an Équiterre study that might be ringing a bell, Mr. Trudeau. And this would lead Canada to respect its targets, because right now the 2009 targets of Mr. Scheer became the 2015 targets of Mr. Trudeau, and they have not been attained. We can also have incentives to electrify transportation, mass transit.
You have Ms. May.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You are absolutely right. What you said is true. We are too close to a point of no return. We have to avoid the worst scenario. The Green Party is the only party that has a platform that is in line with the advice of the IPCC scientists. We know that it is essential to create a war cabinet like the one that existed during World War II. We must work together because we have to get off fossil fuels, stop our dependence, and we have to change our economy into a green economy.
Ms. May, Ms. Darvaux and Trois-Rivières, I hope this was informative, and those are the responses they give you. Thank you very much for participating tonight. We appreciate that. Thank you very much. So the first three-way debate, there will be Ms. May, Mr. Trudeau, and Mr. Blanchet. Since the Kyoto Protocol 30 years ago, politicians have been promising to cut greenhouse gases. But to reach the Paris targets, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has estimated that the carbon tax, which is currently $20 per ton, must climb to $102 over the next few years. And to be concrete for people at the home, that's 23 cents extra for a liter of gas. Mr. Blanchet, you agree with the $102. Ms. May, you're proposing $200. Mr. Trudeau, are you waiting for after the elections to disclose your price?
Oh, Mr. Lewan, we have a plan to increase that price to $50 a ton in 2022. But these numbers, $100, $200 a ton, that's if nothing else is done other than a price on pollution. We have chosen to put in place a wide range of measures to protect nature, to invest in ending coal energy production, to end the use of single-use plastics, to plant 2 billion trees. We know it's going to take a lot of effort to do all this, but we are going to do these things because we're already doing more than any other government has done in the history of this country to protect the environment and to fight climate change.
Open debate.
Yes, thank you. But the problem is that it's not enough to just talk about a price on carbon. We also have to have targets that are aligned with scientific advice. And right now it's not 30% of 2005 levels by 2030. That's Mr. Trudeau's target, which is the same as Mr. Harper's target. It's not enough. We have to have a plan to eliminate fossil fuels by 2050, and by 2030 we have to have a target of 60% reductions of greenhouse gases, and it is truly possible. Our plan is called Mission Possible because it is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible. It's not just with the carbon tax.
I think we should be more specific. Yes, in the end, it should be that the only oil we use is oil that is not burned. It must be used for something else. We must put a date on that, a time frame for it. And then we need to see how long will it take to cut down on extraction, on transport, and so on. Let's not talk about measures in 2025 or 2030. What are the targets? 3% less next year, 3% less the year after that? And that also pertains to getting all the oil that's in the soil of Alberta. We propose a green equalization. We have an average in Canada. The provinces that pollute the most pay into this green equalization, and the best performers get money.
This initiative, Mr. Blanchet, highlights one of the big challenges that you have as leader of the Bloc Québécois, which is to impose a pan-Canadian plan, you need a government that's ready to do it, a government that's ready to stand up to Jason Kenney, to the oil companies, ready to stand up to Doug Ford, and all those conservatives who don't want to do anything for the environment. And there are 4 of us here who will fight to protect the environment, and our government has done a lot over the last 4 years. But we know that we need to keep going, and that's why we can't stop. It's important that Quebecers, Francophones, and Canadians be part of a government that wants to fight climate change.
The reality is that the situation right now is a climate emergency. We have to move quickly. And now all of the other leaders here on scene with me, there is no one who has a workable plan to avoid the worst-case scenario. Greta Thunberg is right. Our house is on fire. How dare you?
Mr. Trudeau.
Yes.
In terms of the pipeline, Mr. Scheer was Quebec during it was clear he could force East pipeline on Quebec, but you weren't clear. There could be a project tomorrow morning on the table. Mr. Trudeau, would you oppose a pipeline or not?
That's part of a process that requires that we have approval from communities, approval from Indigenous peoples. We need to work with the scientific community to look at the impact, and we'll move forward the same way we moved forward with the Trans Mountain pipeline to try to get approval and to do it in a rigorous scientific way. People know that we can't have more oil by rail. We know that it's very dangerous and that it pollutes a lot. We need to put the profits from what we need right now, because we know that the transition isn't going to happen tomorrow. We need to put the profits towards green energy, towards the fight against climate change, and every dollar of profit will go to green initiatives.
Mr. Trudeau, you are proposing to use public funds for a pipeline in a situation of crisis. It's a climate emergency. We have to stop all pipelines. We have to stop shale gas everywhere in Canada.
But
if we have just this chance to avoid the worst case scenario, that's what the scientists are telling us. This is not a question of political targets. This is a question of what's actually happening.
First, Quebec does not want. Will you tell Quebec, no, there will be no pipeline in Quebec? Second thing, if we make proposals in the chamber and you find that they're good proposals, you say that we can't implement it, well, will you vote in favor of our ideas?
Answer, Mr. Trudeau, before we move on the other three-way debate.
We've created a system with C69 which allows us to get approval for good projects, and bad projects won't move ahead.
A good project could move
Good
ahead.
pipeline, does that exist?
So you would oppose it?
Listen, it's better than having more oil by rail.
Second three-way debate. Mr. Singh, Mr. Bernier, and Mr. Scheer. We're going to move on with continue with the pipelines, because there's been a lot of talk about this. The Legault government has repeated that in Quebec there is no social license. Mr. Bernier, Mr. Scheer, you're in favor of a pipeline, and you say that's your right under the Canadian Constitution, but do you not fear backlash, an anti-Canadian sentiment in Quebec or an anti-Quebec sentiment in Western Canada if you impose a pipeline, Mr. Scheer?
That is the reason for which I put forward the idea of an energy corridor, because I know that Quebecers would prefer homemade and Canadian energy. A lot of Quebec's energy goes to the United States, and they buy gas and petrol from the United States. This is nonsensical. I want Canada to be able to share its own natural resources from west to east. It's the best option for all Canadians and Quebecers.
The energy corridor that Mr. Scheer is proposing is going to take years to build. We urgently need a pipeline, and you're right about the Constitution and constitutional peace and the nation's unity, and that is why Albertans are calling for the right to export their oil to other markets in addition to the US market. And I don't think that Mr. Scheer will, in fact, go to the Constitution to force the construction of pipelines. But Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Scheer have the same stance on climate change. Mr. Scheer will put big price on big polluters, and we say that we're going to leave this up to the provinces. Quebec is doing very well. We should leave it up to the provinces to take firm action on the environmental front.
I think I can sum the situation up here for viewers. This is Mr. Pipeline, and this is Mr. Pipeline 2, and Mr. Trudeau, I'm not so sure. But I'm Jagmeet Singh. I will never force a pipeline on Quebec. That is clear.
Mr. Scheer?
The current plan put forward by Mr. Trudeau was to give huge exemptions for large polluters. Large companies that have a special agreement with government, taxpayers and Canadian workers have to pay 100% of their carbon tax. There are no taxes in my plan.
Hold on. You would place a massive exemption for the biggest emitters.
You will not tax anything. You won't win anything with my plan. Canadians will no longer pay.
We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens, Mr.
We will
Scheer.
invest in technology. we will fight against climate change in a global context. That is what is missing in all other platforms.
Go ahead.
Well, listen, Mr. Scheer wants to take Canadian taxpayers' money to combat climate change, but in other countries abroad, and hand over billions of dollars to combat climate change elsewhere. But the fact of the matter is we need to protect Canada's climate back home. And the fact of the matter is that there are so much raw sewage that is dumped in our lakes, in our rivers. This is an increase of 10% vis-à-vis 2013. We need to invest in that and do that for Canadians.
500,000 children, young people, were in the streets demonstrating in Montreal, and they said action is urgently needed. Mr. Trudeau says a lot of nice things, but he doesn't do much. He doesn't work for people. What we need now is to give young people hope. We can say, yes, we can go ahead. We can get rid of subsidies to the oil patch. We can reinvest in clean energy. We can invest massively in public transit. We can act now, and we have to act right now.
Mr. Scheer, I have a question for you to relaunch the debate. You want to abolish the carbon tax. Is it not like granting people a permit to pollute for life?
Absolutely not. It doesn't give them free rein. Currently, there's no price on carbon in Quebec, but there's a cap and trade system in Quebec that Quebec itself instituted. Well, you're right. And the environment is a shared area of jurisdiction between the federal government and the provinces, and under the People's Party of Canada's plan, we will leave it up to the federal government to make sure our waterways are clean, and it's incredible. The City of Montreal and the City of Vancouver had to take action against this raw sewage being dumped in their waterways. We want a clean environment, but not through the carbon tax.
What is clear is that with the Liberal government's plan, Mr. Trudeau gave huge exemptions to the biggest polluters. So when he put a price on carbon, it wasn't for big polluters, it was simply for everyone, for Canadian workers. And that is the problem with his approach. My approach will focus on technology through taxation, and not taxation, rather.
The problem with Mr. Scheer is that your plan was written for industry. That's unacceptable.
Thank you very much, sirs. That ends our three-way debate. I thank you for your discipline. Everything's going well up until now. Good evening, François Cardinal from La Presse. Your question to the...
Ms. May, I'll begin with you. You want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a drastic fashion in Canada. You said so earlier. I'll ask you the question directly. Would you not object to an economic downturn in Canada? And even though some people say this could lead to thousands of lost jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Cardinal. That is a very relevant question. No, I am not in favor of a shrinking of the economy, but I am in favor of a transformation of the Canadian economy because, as Mr. Scheer said, we need a corridor and national infrastructure, but not for pipelines, only for decarbonized electricity with growth in our capacity to use renewable energy, wind energy, and solar energy as well. We have economic opportunities without
Thank you, Ms. May. Next question for Mr. Blanchet. A brief question for you. You said you're very proud of your environmental platform. You talked about green equalization. How do you explained your support to the third link between Quebec City and Lévis?
I did not support the third link. I said I was not against. I didn't say I was in favor either, for simple reasons. First, the Environment Minister asked for an assessment. I've been Environment Minister in Quebec before, and I respect that process. If you ask an institution, and by the way, we would like this institution to have precedence over federal environmental assessment, so if we ask that institution to assess the project, let's wait for the result. And ultimately, the third link is of Quebec's government purview. It's out of the federal's purview. There's this interference all the time from the federal. It's very irritating, and I think that we should make good decisions once the assessment is done.
You believe in fighting climate change, but you always say it is on condition that it happens globally. Is this not a convenient way of asking other countries to do their part while Canada continues to blithely pollute?
Not at all. With my plan, we have a balanced approach. We have a whole range of measures to reduce our emissions, for example, through investing in technology, through a tax credit for corporations and businesses that adopt new production methods. But we have to recognize the fact that Canada emits only 1.6% of global emissions. If we chase investments out of Canada, life will be more expensive for all Canadians. China and India's economies will replace our emissions, which will be useless. That's why we want a global approach.
Mr. Singh, last year at the beginning of the year, you were not against the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but then you changed your mind in the course of the year. What are we to make of your contortions and flip-flops on the transportation of oil and gas?
It's clear to me that the future of our country and our planet is a future without any fossil fuels. That's the future. And what I want to do for children who are worried about the future, for families dealing with flooding, for people who say they're afraid of forest fires, I say this: I will make every effort to tackle the climate crisis. We have to do it. We can do it. And to me, that is a firm commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. Trudeau, in 2015, you promised to end subsidies to the oil patch, and yet not only did you buy a pipeline during your mandate, we mentioned this earlier, but you also offered to support the oil sector by over $1 billion. How can we today believe your promises on the environment?
Still working towards, we are on track to meeting our targets and ending subsidies to the oil sector in 2025. It takes a progression. We know that the transition isn't going to happen overnight, and that's why we are investing in the right way in green energy, in renewable energy, and all the profits, the hundreds of millions of dollars of profits that will come from that pipeline will be invested in that transition, in the fight to fight climate change. We have delivered over the last 4 years, and we have to continue to move forward. We need a strong government full of Quebecers and Francophones, a government that will continue to stand up to the Conservatives who don't want to do anything.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Last question for you, Mr. Bernier. You are the only leader to reject the scientific consensus on the climate crisis by always quoting the same handful of controversial outliers. Mr. Bernier, why do you reject science?
First, I don't deny the science. In fact, there's a number of scientists who wrote to the Secretary-General of the United Nations to state that there is no climate emergency. I was clear on this. We shouldn't propagate fear about an emergency that doesn't exist. It should be grounded in truth and reality. There should be more studies, and there are some studies on the impact of the sun on climate change, and most of the studies to date have been in the impact of climate, of CO2. And Ms. May is right. There are the Paris targets, but unfortunately, they will destroy the economy, as you said earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Bernier.
Thank you very much, François. Thank you. Now, on our second theme, economy and finances. And with us in the room tonight, we have a Canadian, Marie Saint-Jean, who would like to ask a question to the leaders.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for being with us. We're listening.
Here's my question. When you're elderly and retired, life is much more expensive when you live alone instead of with another person. We all know this. And you cannot, among other things, take advantage of of income splitting, and you're alone in covering all of your expenses. So, do you intend to increase pensions for the elderly or increase the age credit? What tax measures will you intend to introduce to help seniors living alone?
Very good question. Thank you very much. Mr. Blanchet, you can answer first.
Good evening, Ms. Saint-Jean. What you said is remarkable. The baby boomers, as you know, will retire very shortly. And they deserve a happy and hopefully prosperous retirement because they built the society in which we live. So we propose increasing by $110 the old age pension. And there will be various tax credits. Also, we propose that after that a spouse has died, the living spouse gets the benefits for a few months. These are various measures that are in our platform because we believe it's important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blanchet. Mr. Scheer.
What is clear is that the cost of living is a very important issue in this campaign. This is the pillar of our platform. We'll make life more affordable for all Canadians, for all Quebecers. More specifically, for seniors, those who have retired, we will increase the age credit by $1,000. Many of our tax credits will also be available to you. For example, the transit tax credit. We will also eliminate GST for people who have a fixed income. That is also very important.
Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you, Ms. Saint-Jean, for your question. One of the first things that we did was increase the GIS for our most vulnerable seniors, often women living alone. But we know that there's more to do, and that's why we have promised to improve OAS. We'll increase it by 10% for those over 75. And if somebody loses their partner, we know that that's a very difficult moment, and that's why we are going to increase the survivors' benefit for the CPP and the QPP by up to 75%, because we know that supporting our seniors is essential in a rich and generous society like ours.
Your answer.
Thank you, Ms. Saint-Jean. I will add, as I forgot at the beginning, that I recognize that we are here on unceded Algonquin land, Miigwech. And I will say that, yes, the Green Party is committed to increasing pension benefits, and I'm 65 years old myself. So I am in the same position, but I'm not ready to retire just yet. But I will set up a strategy for seniors, and I will also set up a minister within the federal cabinet, and that minister will have the goal of reducing the cost of living of seniors.
Well, we've just seen that all the other leaders on the stage have promised you what you essentially want to hear. And the fact of the matter is that you'll see that there'll be an increase to the seniors' pension. But clearly, the country is indebted, and we are bereft of means. The only solution is to balance the budget in 2 years, and at that point, and only at that point, will we consider tax breaks. And the other leaders are behaving as if there was no deficit, and as if nothing was wrong. It's crucial that we balance the budget immediately. Were there to be a recession in the next couple of years, we have no more wiggle room left. I'm not going to make promises that I can't keep.
Thank you for the question. You've raised an issue that affects a lot of people, and thank you for taking the time to explain your situation. I think it's ridiculous that seniors have to deal with this kind of challenge. People who've sacrificed a lot, they are entitled to retire with dignity. And that's why we're setting up programs to help you. We will help with pensions, and we will increase and improve services to seniors. We're talking about pharmacare, dental care. This will bring down the cost of living and help you save money. And we would also put limits on fees and charges, and that would help too.
Do you feel more informed about how you're going to vote? I'm not asking you who you're going to vote for.
Well, all of the platforms are interesting, but in 4 years, we'll see.
Thank you very much.
Now,
Now, we're moving on to our three-way debate between Mr. Singh, Ms. May, and Mr. Blanchet. None of you three have proposed tax cuts. On the contrary, you are proposing new taxes and new expensive programs. Do you not think that the middle class needs a break? I'll start with you, Mr. Singh.
I think that the middle class needs help. We will never increase taxes on the middle class, on workers. The problem is that the wealthiest Canadians aren't paying their fair share. The wealthiest Canadians have a lot of money and they're not sharing it. So what we're going to do is not just nice talk like Mr. Trudeau. We're going to put a tax on the ultra-wealthy. This will give us access to $70 billion in revenues, new revenues. We've seen other governments invest in big companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, but I prefer to invest in people. I don't work for the rich, I work for you.
I also work for the people in our platform is the only one in this election that has actually been costed. We have a costed platform, and we have proven where we're going to get the revenue. And Mr. Singh has said it, they're going to tax the richest of the rich, but there's also a tax on web giants like Facebook and Netflix. And we are going to find those funds because we must devote more funds to Canadians. We have to eliminate tuition. We have to invest in post-secondary education as well. We are completely committed to a pharmacare program as well. But for we know that we can do everything we can to help seniors, and we want to find the priorities that we need to focus on and find the revenue that we need to balance the budget in 5 years.
A small detail. Besides Mr. Scheer and Mr. Singh, I think everybody has costed platforms, Madame May, that respect the rules as far as I'm concerned. I agree with the principle that we need to find new revenue streams, and I agree that they can't come from the same pockets. However, there are tax havens, there's tax evasion that always favor the same players. It is true that we can tax the web giants with a 3% levy. We're talking here hundreds of millions of dollars, but I think that that levy should be used to help the media and the cultural sector. So I think we can work that way, but I think we should also look at the green equalization, which will lower the expenses of the federal government. And I think we can save $400 million by having a single tax return for citizens, for companies. That was a unanimous request from the National Assembly. Of course, the Bloc will bring that question to Ottawa. And Mr. Singh said he was in agreement as long as there were no job losses. And I think we can all agree there would be no job losses with a single tax return. There's $400 million for you.
I'd like to add another thing. It's a matter of revenue, but it's also a matter of choices. Over the past year, what Mr. Trudeau did was spend a lot of money, $14 billion, for the biggest companies so they could buy planes and get a seat on the Security Council, and also $5 billion to buy a pipeline, and also in corporate welfare, he said he would cut $6 billion, write off $6 billion in corporate debt. That's $25 billion that Mr. Trudeau gave away to the wealthiest corporations.
What we received often as questions from the public involves growing concern about the debt and the deficit, which are increasing. So does that concern you?
The deficit worries me because the Liberal government has given billions away to the wealthiest Canadians. If that money had been used to invest in Canadians, that would be quite a different matter.
Platform, the budget will be balanced in 5 years, unless there's something like a recession. But I would like to add that subsidies for the oil sector have increased over the last 4 years.
Finding the money in the pockets of the wealthy is one thing, sending it to the right people is another thing, and reducing the debt is a third thing. We can't say that within a few days we're going to cut so much. The impact on the economy would be too much. In our platform, we want to cut the deficit by half. I would love to do it faster, but it's important that we get new revenue streams. That revenue, that income, has not come from taxpayers, but rather from the web giants, from subsidies we can sell Trans Mountain. We should not invest any more in Trans Mountain. That's how we can find a lot of money.
Now we're going to move on to our second three-way debate on the economy. Mr. Bernier, Mr. Trudeau, and Mr. Scheer. Mr. Trudeau, you have no plan to return to a balanced budget. Mr. Bernier, you want to cut lively. You said it earlier. Mr. Scheer, we still haven't seen your costed platform, your figures. Where are you going to cut things?
First of all, I made a very clear commitment. We will balance the budget in 5 years. All of our announcements were sent to the Parliamentary Budget Officer for his calculations, contrary to Mr. Trudeau, who put forward a platform that was simply written on the corner of a napkin.
But that's
over 50% of his
ridiculous, Mr. Scheer. We presented a real plan.
Where are your numbers,
Trudeau? Full plan, a full costed plan. It was approved in part by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. But the reality is that we are so ambitious with our investments and our middle-class tax cuts. Mr. Scheer, unlike you, are promising a tax cut of $50,000 for multimillionaires. You have a universal tax cut which helps families who make $400,000 a year more than families who make $40,000 a year.
Let's talk about that.
Mr. Scheer, finish up, and then it'll be Mr.
That's a lie. You lied when the Globe and Mail published the story. You lied when you said that Jody Wilson labeled
Mr. Scheer,
and you are lying today.
We lowered taxes for the middle class, and we increased them for the richest Canadians, and you voted against
for 80% of Canadians in the middle class, Mr. Trudeau.
Started off well, but speak one at a time, please. Mr. Bernier.
Well, if I look around me here, the party leaders, they all say they're going to balance the budget, but in 5 years' time, and they're asking for a term in office of 4 years, so no one will end up balancing the budget. And Mr. Scheer is talking about adding billions of dollars to the debt. Mr. Trudeau's going to follow suit. It's irresponsible. Our national credit card is full and overflowing. It's brimming. So the only thing is to stop corporate welfare, put an end to subsidies to corporations, and if we want to kickstart the economy, we have to put money back in the pockets of business people, in bourse, across Canada, and we're going to do this because we're going to find the money to balance the budget within 2 years.
This is a conservative argument. We've heard it many times. We heard that for 10 years under Mr. Harper, and you were both part of that party. We saw cuts. We saw tax cuts for the richest Canadians. We saw underinvestment in infrastructure, in seniors, in our young people, and they didn't deliver economic growth. Over the last 4 years, we have invested in the middle class. We have seen 1 million new jobs created. We have seen the lowest unemployment rate in the history of this country, and we've lifted 900,000 people out of poverty.
Too many lies in this discourse. I don't even have time to answer to all of them. People with the lowest revenue levels benefited from our plan. Trudeau's excuse was to invest in infrastructure, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer clearly stated that there was no plan. We have the worst of both worlds. We have large deficits and no plan to help infrastructure, and the cost of these deficits keep on increasing. More and more of taxpayers' money is being paid for simple interest.
Listen, Mr. Scheer is telling you that there have been no investments in infrastructure, but people can go out and look in their cities, in their communities, and see the investments in infrastructure that we have made. Investments in social housing, investments that we have chosen to make because the Conservatives under Mr. Harper underinvested, and we made the choice of investing in a reasonable way in our future, and it's working.
Yes, but at the same time, you're running a deficit, and you have to pay back the interest on the debt. We're talking about $26 billion per year. We have no wiggle room left, no leeway left. And many economists are saying we're on the verge of a recession in a couple of years. And if that's the case, it's going to be a disaster in terms of social programs. We need an accountable, responsible system, tax system. You just create the way
it's exactly that. By making investments in people, in workers, in families, that creates resiliency in families and communities. We don't need to create a big pot of money for when we need it. We need to make those investments in people so that they can be strong, so that they can resist in difficult times. And I completely disagree with you. I completely disagree. They're going to cut, we're going to invest.
Justin Trudeau.
Your figures. I started to ask you questions.
Justin Trudeau increased the tax burden on everyone. He increased taxation on 80% of middle-class families. What we have proposed is a plan to balance the budget in 5 years.
We haven't seen your numbers. Where are your numbers?
Your costings, Mr. Trudeau?
I don't have the right to bring my
over 50% of your commitments are not costed.
Merci. Fin de bloc, c'est normal. Ça s'échauffe, c'est normal. Pensez aux gens à la maison. Pensez aux gens à la maison.
Think about people who are listening to you and who want to hear you. Hélène Buzetti from the Devoir, good evening.
Mr. Scheer, let's begin with you quickly because many Canadians wrote to us on this topic. Will you change the retirement age, which now stands at 65? We still haven't seen your costed platform, but you want to balance the budget in 5 years. The former Conservative government made cuts to culture and scientific research. Will you do the same thing to eliminate the deficit?
We have already announced places where we will be able to find savings for Canadians. We will protect culture, we will protect investments in technology and in research. We will eliminate $1.5 billion in corporate subsidies, and we will cut foreign assistance by 25%. We will keep the money here in Canada until we can make people's life more affordable. We will reduce taxes. We'll reintroduce
cuts to science.
Sports tax
What about the census? Will that stay? Yes. Next question, Mr. Bernier. You promised to get rid of supply management in agriculture. People are increasingly talking about buying and eating local. So what would you say to consumers who fear their grocery stores will be flooded by U.S. dairy and chicken products?
Well, first and foremost, they'll have the freedom to choose. And of course, they'll have to adhere to Canadian food safety standards. But the fact of the matter is Canadian households will save $400 a year by abolishing this socialist supply management cartel system. But, well, it's easy to balance a budget, and you could do so by cutting back on international aid. And one way of helping the poorest in Canada is to do away with the supply management cartel so Canadians can save money.
Your costed platform was shredded because you would increase government spending by $70 billion a year beginning in the first year. How will you convince voters that you're credible when it comes to managing the public purse?
Because our costed platform was examined by the Institute for Fiscal Responsibility and Democracy, and by the former Parliamentary Budget Officer Kevin Page, and he gave it a passing grade. But we are the only ones who have a comprehensive costed platform. But the reality is that we have to do more. We are a wealthy country. We have to create a better system for social justice. We have to invest in childcare and in seniors.
That's all the time we have. Thank you. Mr. Trudeau, in 2015, you proposed deficit spending to fund infrastructure projects. Canadians supported you. In 2019, you proposed that Canada continue to live on credit and to add another $100 billion to the debt, but for operational expenses. If there is a recession, how much wiggle room will you have?
That what's important is helping our young people find good jobs and get the education they need, in helping families offer possibilities to their children so that they can grow safely and take advantage of all the opportunities that might present themselves. Our plan has worked over 4 years. 900,000 people have been lifted out of poverty.
Mr. Trudeau, So will you have wiggle room, or will there be deficits 2 or 3 times the size?
Yes, we're going to have some room to maneuver because our plan has been rated AAA by international credit ratings agencies. Only Germany and Canada have unanimous AAA credit rating because our plan is responsible and reasonable when it comes to our finances.
Mr. Singh, as with Mr. Scheer, you still have not unveiled your costed platform, but we know you are putting forth very expensive programs like pharmacare and dental care. You say that you'll make the rich pay, but experts say that politicians always overestimate those numbers. The wealthy can hire good tax experts. So how can you dissipate the impression that your plan is based on wishful thinking?
What we're going to do is, first of all, it's hard to make tough choices, but we will make those choices. We chose very specific numbers because with the tax on the ultra-wealthy, those who have over $20 million, we're going to impose a 1% tax. And we reckon that with a 1% tax, it's going to be harder to hide money than to just pay that tax. So it's realistic. And if we can increase revenues, then we can do more. We can do this.
Mr. Blanchette, you're against pipelines, but you have not denounced Quebec's LNG pipeline, which will go all the way to Saguenay. Can you tell us whether you are against fossil fuels only when Alberta makes money?
To be consistent in my answers, and I've answered this previously, there's a public hearing bureau in Quebec. I think I said clearly that oil and fossil fuel are energies of the past. It's not our future. These are not the projects we must invest in. But as a former Minister of Environment, I'm waiting for the BAP's report. I don't know if it'll be favorable to LNG, but we'll see. We will table a bill asking that the hearing office in Quebec has precedence on the environmental assessments in Ottawa. I think that the Bureau will be quite stern in its assessment.
For your questions. This is the end of the second theme. We're moving on to our next theme now. Services to Canadians. To begin this theme, we have a Canadian in Toronto, well, in the region, in Mississauga. Mr. Gravel, the leaders are listening to you. You want to talk about services in French for French minority communities outside of Quebec. We're listening.
Good evening. Lady and gentlemen, living in a minority context is a challenge. With recent provincial cuts, it's become even more difficult, and federally, it's not much better because it's hard to obtain these services. For instance, when you're applying for a passport and you'd like to meet someone who speaks French, well, you'll have to wait 10 times as long, or when you're taking Air Canada from Toronto, it's very difficult to find a French-speaking flight attendant. In fact, it's almost a miracle. And despite many complaints filed with the Official Languages Commissioner, nothing seems to change. So my question is this: what tools would you give the Official Languages Commissioner so that the Commissioner can finally enforce the law and give all of Canada's Francophones adequate services and equal services to others?
Very clear question, Mr. Scheer. You answer first.
Thank you very much for your question. This is a very important issue as well. Perhaps this may be a surprise, but French is not my first language. I was born in Ottawa, and it's thanks to my Anglophone parents' decision that I learnt French in an immersion school program. I've made a lot of effort. I've been learning my subjunctive as best as possible. I've always tried to improve my French. More tangibly, I organized a meeting between all federal leaders to rectify the issue with the Francophone University. I clearly supported this university, and I proposed to modernize the Official Languages Act.
Thank you very much, Ms. May.
thank you, Mr. Gravel. That is an extremely important question. It has been too long. We have not modernized the Official Languages Act, and we must do it. But you wanted a concrete answer, and what I think is extremely important to do is to give the Official Languages Commissioner the power to apply sanctions and to demand that all agencies, all federal agencies, provide proper, equal services in both official languages. And that I'll do in the first year of my mandate.
Well, thank you for your question. It's very important. The federal government needs to invest more heavily in its areas of jurisdiction, and that's what we'll do for official languages and the other services the federal government provides to Canadians. There are other leaders on this stage that say they're going to invest in social housing, healthcare, and education. These are provincial bailiwicks, provincial areas of jurisdiction. Our policy is to honour the Canadian institution and not ride roughshod over provincial areas of jurisdiction, to give the federal government the resources it needs to provide quality services to francophones outside Quebec and also anglophones in Quebec. Other services you referred to. A strong federal government, but within its own.
Quebecers know what it is to be a minority, because even though Francophones in Quebec are a majority, we're a minority in North America. Francophones that live outside of Quebec and Acadians are our Francophone brothers and sisters. I think that the Official Languages Commissioner should bring back the notion of reciprocity. It's important that Francophone communities outside of Quebec and the Acadian communities get the same level of service that the precious and historical English-speaking minority in Quebec get. They should get the same level of service.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gravel, for that question. As you can tell, I'm not a Francophone, but I am a Francophile, very much so. I didn't have French immersion, but in my childhood, I fell in love with the French language, the language of Molière, and I want to share that wealth because it has been a source of wealth in my life. What we want to do in concrete terms is modernize the Official Languages Act, better fund services in French, because there are things that can be done, but it's a matter of courage and political will, and we have that courage and that will because it's so important.
Thank you, Mr. Gravel, for your question. You'll remember, like me, what Mr. Ford has done since he came to power. He's cut services to Francophones, even though he said that he was going to help that community when he was going to be elected. He said he was for the people, but he made cuts. We have defended Francophone minorities in Ontario and across the country, and we will continue to do that. We made a record investment in Francophone communities or official languages minority communities across the country, and we have committed to modernizing the Official Languages Act. We understand the fight that you're fighting every day, and we will always be alongside you in that fight.
Mr. Trudeau, I'd like to thank most importantly Mr. Gravel for asking his question. Thank you. I hope that was informative for you. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to the first three-way debate on services to Canadians. We have Mr. Singh, Mr. Scheer, and Mr. Blanchet. There's a question, and you can, of course, intervene. I'm going to talk about Indigenous affairs. We've talked about a cultural genocide. We've talked about residential schools, missing women, reserves without housing or drinking water. And here's my question. It's very simple. It can't be easier. What are you going to do tangibly to improve living conditions for Indigenous people? Mr. Scheer, we'll start with, Singh, rather, we'll start with you.
Here we go again, and I wore my orange turban again. But anyways, that's a very serious question. What I've seen is Mr. Trudeau. He talks a good game publicly, but the decisions he makes privately are the problem. When it comes to Indigenous communities, if there was a willingness to do something right away, it could be done. It's as simple as that. If the decision was to fund Indigenous kids the same way as other Canadian kids. That could be done. It shouldn't have to go to court. I would respect Indigenous communities. It's a matter of dignity. If you start with that recognition, it could solve so many problems. Equal funding is the starting point.
Go
ahead, Mr. Scheer.
Thank you very much. With regards to respecting Indigenous peoples, we have to respect when Indigenous communities say yes to projects to help economic growth. When we speak about remote or rural communities, sectors that create the most jobs for First Nations is the mining, the forestry, and the energy sectors. And that is the reason for which I said that I would appoint a minister whose portfolio would be to consult in a dynamic way so that we meet our obligations with our treaties.
Our relationships with the First Peoples have well, there's a lack of trust there. That's my understanding, because these are truly nations that have the same rights, privileges, obligations as any other nation. There's been a UN declaration, there are studies, there are commissions, there are inquiries, and they say, I'm okay with saying it because it comes from them, but they say that there's never any follow-up. We never implement any clear measure. The debate is theoretical, but meanwhile there's no real solution, there's no respect that is established, there's no trust that is built. We will need to deeply change our relationship with Indigenous peoples.
I fully agree with what Mr. Blanchet just said. And in fact, if we're going to talk about respect, I visited Grassy Narrows, and they have a mercury poisoning problem there. But Mr. Trudeau, at a private event, made fun of someone who was an advocate, saying that their water was poisoned. What are you going to do about it? And he said, thanks for your donation. It's incomprehensible how someone could do that. If you had visited that community and seen the impact of that poisoning on people's bodies, how people are trembling because of that intoxication, that poisoning, I have no words for it. It's incredible.
We're going to stop this three-way debate now. Mr. Trudeau, you've been asked a very specific question. I'll give you 30 seconds to answer.
Thank you. We have made huge investments in Indigenous communities across the country, and with the community of Grassy Narrows, we are working with them to approve a treatment center, and we will make sure that the funding is in place for that treatment center.
We'll talk about Indigenous issues in your debate.
This is a bit shocking. We're able to find billions of dollars in order to buy a pipeline, but after years and years and years, we don't have enough money so that Indigenous communities have clean water. We should have respect and dignity for peoples that are peoples as much as we are. Please.
That almost all the parties, one after the other, have noted that it's very difficult to make improvements concretely. Mr. Scheer.
This is a challenge. It is essential for us to have a government that meets its responsibilities in a serious way. That is my commitment to First Nations. We will make sure that not only are there investments, we want there to also be a new system to make sure that investments work. It's not just a question of money, it's a question of re-establishing the dynamics in our departments and agencies. I've asked First Nations statutes to be modernized so that they can benefit from natural resources on reserve.
The problem,
natural resources are the key, in your opinion?
The key to this problem is that conservative and liberal governments have chosen to neglect Indigenous communities. They had the opportunity to do something if they wanted to. When they have a chance to do something for the oil patch, they jump on the chance to buy a pipeline
2 seconds.
at a huge cost.
If you're going to do something, do it alongside First Nations. Do not impose it top-down. They have the right to be part of decision-making.
That's the end of that three-way debate. We're going to move on to the onto the theme of Indigenous peoples, Mr. Trudeau. This is very recent. Last Thursday, you appealed a judgment that ordered the government to pay $40,000 to Indigenous children that were given to child protection. Were you not supposed to be the champion of reconciliation?
And we are, and we continue to champion reconciliation. We agree with the court that we absolutely have to compensate those children, and we're going to do that. We're going to work with them to establish the right level of compensation. But we have made concrete investments over the last 4 years. We were able to get rid of 87 long-term boil water advisories after 10 years where Mr. Harper did nothing. We've created new schools. We have made new investments in partnership with Indigenous peoples. But we understand that we need to continue to move forward. There's still a lot to do, but Chief Perry Bellegarde of the Assembly of First Nations has recognized that no government has done more for Indigenous peoples than we have.
Yes. Well, Mr. Trudeau, that's not true, because the Human Rights Tribunal has a ruling, and the lawyers for your government contested the results. It's not true what you said about being comfortable with the decision. The lawyers of the federal government are trying to overturn the ruling in favor of Indigenous children. It's a scandal.
With the court that we must compensate these children.
Listen, there are still problems.
I'm trying to understand, why do you appeal the decision?
Because the timeline of doing it by December doesn't work with the elections that we're in right now.
Yes, but
we are going to compensate those children, but it's going to take a bit of time to do it the right way.
I worked as a lawyer. Oh, I'm sorry.
Even today, not all reservations have running water, drinking water. It's not a question of money. The federal government has spent billions on public relations with Indigenous communities. The status quo just doesn't work. It's been years that we've been talking about building better relationships with Indigenous peoples, and that's true. But we need to start by abolishing the Indian Act. There needs to be greater autonomy on reservations. There needs to be a property rights on reservation, and there needs to be wealth creation on reservations. There needs to be pipelines built in collaboration with the First Nations so money can flow back to these Indigenous communities. I agree that we have to get past the Indian Act, but it's up to the Indigenous peoples to decide how that's going to happen. There are several communities who have already done that, and we are working with all communities to allow them to do that, but at their speed and respecting their priorities.
I'd like to ask you to look at a question on culture now. We only brushed over it earlier. Some of you and Mr. Trudeau, it took you a long time, but you did make it a part of your commitments to impose a tax on web giants. Would you commit to giving this money back to the artists who produce the content and who only receive
That's exactly your proposal.
crumbs? They only receive the crumbs. Mr. Trudeau,
We are going to do more than just investing that money in culture.
Listen. This is our proposal. 3% levy, not a tax, a levy, because these giant companies exploit content that is not theirs. So that would be hundreds of millions of dollars for entertainment. Yes, of course, yes, it would be for the artists. So 40% of it would go to the francophone sector, as we see in the music industry.
Are we allowed to answer in long sentences? I would have said a lot more.
A tax on web giants that make a lot of money off of our economy, and we will make sure that this money will be used to help our programs. We'll create a new administration for digital media. There are many people who create content, but they do not see any revenue because web giants take all the money.
Well, the current system is unfair. These big web giants don't pay the HST. They should pay the HST just like anyone else. This is a federal area of jurisdiction. After we balance the budget, of course we'll reinvest.
Yes, it's a source of revenue for exactly what you propose, to help artists to give that revenue to our cultural community. But I want to add just one thing, because I've worked as a lawyer, and it's not true what the Prime Minister said, that the Human Rights Tribunal is, that he agrees with what it said. It's up to the government to do more.
The problem is that Mr. Trudeau swings to the left during the campaign, but then once he's in office, he swings back to the right. Yes, the internet giants need to be taxed, and we have to reinvest in culture. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. I think this was very informative for people who are watching us. Now I'm going to turn to Patricia Cloutier.
Evening.
Going to ask the rapid-fire questions. We're going to speed things up. Very interesting questions. Go ahead.
I'm expecting 15-second answers. Millions of Canadians have been victims in the last 2 months. Victims of theft of their personal information. Are you willing to follow Great Britain's example and penalize the companies where there has been a data breach? Mr. Singh.
The banks are responsible for protecting their customers' privacy, and when situations like this occur with the banks where there's a breach of privacy, it's the banks who are responsible, and there have to be repercussions.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau.
Yes. We created a digital charter to defend citizens' digital rights, and we are working with Great Britain and France to make sure that Canadians can control their own data and that they can control their information.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet.
We will table in we will ask in Parliament that the ID measures be stronger, and whenever there's a data breach, the company must say that there has been a data breach, and at the end of a year must say how many data breaches there were, and also covers any costs that could be incurred by clients.
Yes, I want to protect personal information. There is no corporation that's above the law.
Yes, it's almost unanimous. Yes, we must protect Canadians from that kind of thing. The banks are negligent, and we have to protect the rights of consumers.
Mr. Scheer.
Yes, we will protect Canadian consumers to ensure the protection of their data. It's Justin Trudeau's government that tried to give Statistics Canada permission to obtain unconsented information from Canadians.
No, listen. No.
You gave Canadian financial
That's
banking information. It's only when the opposition
utterly
raised the
ridiculous,
point
Mr. Scheer.
that Statistics Canada backpedaled.
I have another question for you. Canadians have been waiting a long time for a high-speed rail link between Quebec and Toronto. Will you commit to this project? If so, when? Mr. Singh.
Yes, that's one of the commitments in our platform, because it has to do with our response to the climate crisis. We're investing in public transit, so we're highly in favor of this high-frequency train. It's a way of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau.
We are making sure that this project is going to go through Trois-Rivières, that it's going to get to Quebec City. There's still a lot of work to do on it, but we are a government that has chosen to invest in infrastructure, unlike the Conservative government and unlike Conservative provinces that don't invest in infrastructure.
That train is the Sasquatch. It's a Yeti. We always speak about it. We never see it. The Liberals promised it in 2015. I remember Mr. Champagne said that it would even have a stop in Shawinigan. And what did they say this year? Well, maybe we'll do a study because we're not really sure. I don't think that the train is going to depart anytime soon.
Mr. Bernier.
Everyone promised investments with money that we quite simply don't have. We don't have this money. And we need to point that out. First, we have to balance the budget. We're not going to buy people's votes. That's not how we're going to start. That's irresponsible, spending billions of dollars when we have so much else to do.
Thank you, Ms.
Starting by balancing the budget.
Thank you, Ms. Cloutier. Absolutely. In our plan, Mission Possible, we wanted to set up a public transit system from coast to coast to coast, and particularly between Toronto and Quebec, and also between Edmonton and Calgary. We have a public transit.
Thank you. Lastly,
system that
Mr.
is Mexico.
60% of the infrastructure program funds are spent on big projects. I spoke to Yves Levesque, our candidate for Trois-Rivières. We support this project because it will help economic growth and will make life simpler for people in that region. We will do that contrary to Mr. Trudeau, who has promises that he never respects.
May be able to take the train one day, so thank you very much.
Alors, prochain thème.
Next theme.
Politique étrangère
Foreign
et
policy
immigration.
and immigration. We're going to start with a question from a Canadian who is in Dieppe in New Brunswick. Philippe Marcel, I think you're at the University of Moncton.
Bonsoir à vous.
Good
Les chefs
evening.
vous écoutent. Votre
The
question.
leaders are listening to you. What's your question?
Bonsoir les chefs.
Good evening, leaders. As you know, in light of the events taking place in Hong Kong, the imprisonment of 2 Canadians, and the many violations of human rights in China, would you be willing to stop trade with China if the situation does not improve?
Thank you very much for your question. First person to respond, Mr. Bernier.
Well, of course, our top priority is obvious. We need to ensure that the 2 Canadians behind bars are repatriated. And, of course, our relationship with China is far from ideal or at its best. Now, that will be a top priority. How will we go about this? We need to reach out to our allies for help. We need to look at our trade relationship with China. Perhaps we'll have to impose tariffs if we don't get the answer we want, and that is to repatriate these Canadians as quickly as possible, in short order. And I'd like to reiterate, we need to make sure that we have a good relationship with all foreign countries. The fact is that with India, that was not the case with Mr. Trudeau.
Recognize that the priority is always to defend Canadians' interests and to defend Canadians, and that's why we have activated all of our allies around the globe to put pressure on China to tell them that, no, this isn't how things are done. You can't arbitrarily detain Canadians for political reasons. We will continue to seek a solution to this issue while recognizing that China is a growing economy that is creating economic opportunities for our producers and for our workers, but we always need to be there to defend our values and our principles, and that's what we will always do.
It's not a big surprise to hear that the Chinese government doesn't respect Justin Trudeau. After Trudeau's disastrous trip to India, many G20 leaders simply have no respect for him. Mr. Trudeau did absolutely nothing to protect Canadians over 9 months or their interests. As Prime Minister, I will remove Canadian money from the Asia Infrastructure Bank. That is a bank that is controlled by the Chinese government. There is no good reason for taxpayers' money to be sent to build bridges and roads in other countries, and that supports China's foreign policy.
We'll go back to that. Mr. Singh.
Yes, the priority is the Canadians who are currently in such a difficult situation. Action has to be taken immediately to help them. That's essential. And yes, on the question of relations with China, we have to be strong. We have to show that we defend human rights. What's going on in Hong Kong, it's very worrisome what's happening there. But with Mr. Trudeau, once again, he swings to the left during the campaign, says a lot of nice things, but then once he's in office, he swings back to the right. Why are arms still being sold to Saudi Arabia?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Philippe Marcel. There is an elephant in the room, and it is the agreement that Mr. Harper agreed to with China. And it's the last parliament, and it was never debated. It wasn't voted on. It was a huge agreement with investors in China that gave rights to Chinese companies to charge Canada when we have regulations or legislation that China doesn't like. So we're talking about legislation to protect the environment, and it's completely secret and it's awful.
Mr. Blanchet.
First, I have a thought for for all the farmers in the region of Belleuil-Chambly that are hindered by supply management because bad negotiations cost them a share of market share rather. Now, the federal government decided to go to have an argument with China. The thing is that we can't always have disputes with these giant and these important countries. There are soy producers, pork producers who are paying the price. So unfortunately, we need to maintain trading relationships with China. And we should speak about Saudi Arabia and how Raif Badawi was treated and the sale of arms with Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blanchet. Thank you very much, Mr. Marcil, for your question, and we're going to continue on with this theme, and we're going to discuss China further and this diplomatic crisis. For 10 months now, as we've mentioned, there are 2 Canadians that have been imprisoned in China in retaliation for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. Mr. Scheer, you want to make the tone with China tougher? And you want and impose customs on Chinese products? Are you proposing the Trump method?
Not at all. This contrasts Justin Trudeau's idleness. During this crisis, Justin Trudeau did nothing. It took him 9 months to appoint a new ambassador. It's only just before dropping the writ that he filed a complaint at the World Trade Tribunal. We will show the Chinese government that we will defend our interests, we will defend our farmers and producers, and we will defend Canadians who are detained. One thing I would like to say is that the government's excuse of not wanting to step into the Huawei affair is that the Prime Minister cannot have a say in a criminal investigation. But for the SNC-Lavalin case, Justin Trudeau tried to butt in. That would be, Trudeau said one thing on one end and did something completely different.
Let's contrast. Canada has the same weight relative to China, States, or Europe. And trading relations with Asia and Europe has always worked. Okay, but why did this start going down the drain recently? It's because Canada has no credibility. We've been discredited. This is why the President of the United States can deny something that's in a press release, can mock the Canadian Prime Minister. I think this is a question of respect. It's a G20 country, should command.
Well, Canada's foreign policy must be grounded in the safety and security of Canadians. And I'd like to point out that we are talking here about immigration policy, and I'm the only one here on the stage who's prepared to say no to the Legault government when it comes to immigration. They want to lower immigration rates. Of course, they want, Mr. Xi wants more and more immigrants. He agrees with Mr. Trudeau about 350,000 new immigrants per year. You've proposed no solution to prevent those who are crossing at Roxanne Road.
Another lie.
Mr. Bernier is clear on immigration. He wants to lower immigration levels. What's your position on that?
I went to Quebec, and all Quebecers said the same thing. There is a lack of labour, and I'm ready to work with Mr. Legault to give Quebec more autonomy when it comes to immigration. I'm the only person who said that. With many Bloc Québécois MPs, this will be impossible because Justin Trudeau will remain as Prime Minister in that situation. And that would guarantee
I'd like to speak, if I may.
more idleness from Justin Trudeau with regards to our borders.
So in other words, voting for the Bloc is voting for the Liberals, voting for the Bloc is voting for the Conservatives, voting for the Bloc is voting for Quebec. We will sit in the House of Commons. It's a democracy, number one. Number two, Mr. Legault and the government of Quebec has asked the powers, not a power, all the immigration powers. You should all commit to give Quebec Quebec every power pertaining to immigration.
You like to claim that you are Mr. Legault's best friend, but please be honest with me. After the election, you will be working for Canadians?
I have news for you, Mr. Scheer.
Who will you vote for at the next provincial elections?
If I can say so politely, I mean,
are you going to be best friends with Legault? Be honest with Canadians.
The Bloc
will you work with the Parti québécois provincially?
National Assembly.
Here is the best example of cacophony.
I know.
And we have 48 seconds left. Too bad for you.
I have 48 seconds.
No, you only have 20 seconds, Mr. Bernier.
I don't think you're being fair with your speaking time. The fact is that Mr. Scheer doesn't agree with Mr. Legault. He wants interviews with each immigrant so that there's a test to ensure that they share our Canadian values. And the whole Roxanne Road issue, well, you haven't tried to fix that. If we want more economic immigrants, we need to help the real refugees.
Thank you, Mr. Bernier.
Refugees.
Mr. Scheer, 10 seconds. Mr. Blanchet, 10 seconds.
I will focus on refugees that flee natural disasters and civil wars, not those that come from New York State. And I will fix that.
How are you going to do that?
I will implement similar principles in Roxham Road, for example. Our system will focus on that kind of system.
A, we should apply Section 10 of the agreement between, say, third parties, so we can close down the Roxham path. And 2,
only a conservative
democracy people who vote for the Bloc have the right to do so.
Very well. Another three-way debate. Mr. Singh, Ms. May, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, we're going to move on with the discussion on immigration. Are you ready to give powers to Quebec, as asked by the Premier? In terms of immigration, there's the whole values test and the issue of lowering levels, thresholds for certain categories.
And Mr. Legault lowered the immigration levels for Quebec because Quebec has a lot of power over immigration, more than any other province, and that's a good thing because of the Quebec identity and because of the need to protect the French language. And if he wants to apply a values test, well, he can do that, and it's appropriate. We recognize the importance that Quebec has more control over immigration. That's something that we have always been able to work well with the government of Quebec on over the last 4 years.
Ms. May?
Yes. The Green Party is absolutely open to talking with Mr. Legault because as Greens, we are absolutely committed to working with the Quebec nation as equals. But at the federal level for the entire country, we are committed to increase the number of immigrants for 2 reasons. We need workers, and at the same time, we have obligations because we are an industrialized country. We have contributed more than our population to the crisis, and we have climate refugees as well.
Quebec, it's very important. We want to better fund integration of newcomers, but there's something I'm concerned about. Mr. Blanchet said voting for the Bloc is voting for Quebec, and that bugs me a little bit because, yes, you're the Bloc, but Quebec has a diversity of opinions, a diversity of regions, a diversity of voices, so you have no monopoly over Quebec. Not at all. You have no monopoly.
I was going to say the same thing because I am a proud Quebecer and I'm Federalist and I'm a proud Canadian. And what we saw in 2015 was that Quebecers chose to be part of a government. And that's what brought an end to 10 years of Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, who didn't invest in culture, who made cuts across the board, and who proposed austerity. And now that the Bloc Québécois wants to come back on the scene and bring Quebecers back into opposition, well, Quebecers need to think about this. Do they want to be part of a government that will continue to fight against climate change, that will continue to work hand in hand with Quebec on shared priorities? That's exactly what we've been doing for 4 years, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Mr. Trudeau, This is all great rhetoric, but you have met with people from the oil patch 1,500 times, and then you bought a pipeline,
We're not on the correct
and then you
topic.
hand out subsidies.
I'm sorry, but this is off topic. We're talking about immigration. I accepted this because powers of Quebec and immigration, it's somewhat related, but we're not going back to pipelines.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Roy. But with regard to immigration, Mr. Trudeau, you did something that you promised never to do, and that was to hide legislation in omnibus budget bills, and then you've hidden things with a violation of refugees' rights. It was hidden in an omnibus bill. So it was something that canceled the human rights of people who were looking for a safe life here in Canada.
That is absolutely false, Ms. May. We understand that Canadians believe that we need to have a fair and strong immigration system that applies to everyone. And we are working to make sure that we protect human rights at the international level. We want to make sure that everyone who arrives at our border, however they get to the border, goes through all of our immigration system, whether they're regular or irregular immigrants or refugees. We have a strong system that continues to apply, but there are people who are trying to trade on fear and division.
We have a clear solution to solve the problem of irregular crossings, and that is to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. But you don't have the courage to do that because you don't have the courage to condemn someone like Trump who is putting children behind bars. Why do you not have the courage to say no to Trump and suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement?
I would appreciate to be able to talk about our relationship with the United States, because we're talking about international relations, and our relationship with the Americans is the most important relationship for our country and for a Canadian Prime Minister. We were able to save NAFTA when faced with American
NAFTA, you opened up a breach in supply management. You increased prices.
Okay, but the question was about the Safe Third Country Agreement.
We are continuing to work with the Americans.
That's a no.
Alec Castonguay is going to join me to ask questions. Rapid-fire questions to each of the leaders. You from the Actualité. Good evening.
Gentlemen, good evening, Ms. May. First question for Mr. Trudeau. Many Canadians wrote to us with their concern about the fact that about 50 migrants cross at Roxham Road at the Canadian border every day. Is that a problem for you?
Yes, it's a problem. Because we are now in a world where there are 70 or 75 million displaced persons. We recognize that we have a responsibility to make sure that these people go through our entire immigration system, and that's what we're doing. We've made the necessary investments, and there's no free pass to get through the border. Whether people arrive in a regular or an irregular way at the border, they have to go through a security check, and they have to go through every step of our immigration
Thank you, Mr.
system.
Trudeau. Ms. May. Climate change is an issue for the entire planet, not just for Canada. Yet in the next 10 years, China intends to open 6 new coal plants every month. How can we ensure that Canadians will not be obliterated by the actions of other countries?
It is not possible for me to guarantee anything, but I am absolutely certain that if Canada keeps doing what it's doing now as a rich, industrialized country with an increase in greenhouse gases, it's impossible for us to play a role worldwide in UN negotiations. In the past, we had the role of a leader. We have lost that role because of our failure against the disaster of climate change. I am convinced that with a plan like Mission Possible, we can still play the role.
Thank you, Ms. May. Mr. Bernier. You want Canada to take in fewer immigrants and fewer refugees. You want to cut foreign aid to poorer countries, and you want Canada to withdraw from the UN. Does Canada have a role to play on the world stage?
Of course, Canada has a role to play on the world stage alongside its allies, but we have to help ourselves back home first as a top priority. And you're right when it comes to immigration. Mr. Trudeau suggested earlier that our stance on immigration is radical. 40% of Canadians want to lower immigration levels. We're the only party that dares to speak up about this. We're the only party to want to stem the tide of mass immigration. We need to focus on economic immigrants. There's always a social cost to having unbridled immigration, unfettered immigration. Look at the rising housing costs in Toronto and Vancouver. 40% of immigrants flow into those cities, and that puts pressure on the housing market. We need lower immigration.
Mr. Scheer, you would cut development aid by 25%, which would bring Canada's contribution to its lowest level since 1965. Doesn't that go against Canadian values?
We will eliminate 25% of foreign aid that currently goes to countries that are relatively rich. We will keep that 25% here to make Canadians' lives more affordable. We will pay for our universal tax cut, $850 for an average household. We will eliminate GST for some
while cutting aid to poorer countries.
We will also eliminate corporate subsidies. We will have a costed platform published very soon, as opposed to Mr. Trudeau, who is hiding the costing of over 50% of his commitments.
Thank you, Mr. Scheer. Mr. Blanchet, you said that Canada should have minded its own business and not arrested Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, on the request of the U.S. In your view, is the rule of law negotiable based on how powerful a client or a country is?
The truth is that the United States decided to call upon trade notions. It was not a criminal thing. It was linked to sanctions that Canada should not follow up on. And when you're on the ice against such a powerful opponent like China, it is the Quebec producers and the Western producers who have to pay the price in the end. I think the government acted irresponsibly. You got to think about the consequences. The Americans didn't come and help us.
How can you enforce our extradition treaties if you don't respond to if we don't respond to our allies?
It was an extradition issue that was related to commercial sanctions imposed by Americans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blanchet.
Mr. Blanchet, Mr. Singh, every time Canada signs a trade agreement, be it with the U.S. or with Europe, the NDP objects. Do you believe in free trade, or are you a protectionist?
In my opinion, it depends what kind of trade. If it's good for workers, then it's a good deal. But what we've seen with Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Scheer, too, as conservatives, they want trade that gives all the power and all the benefits to the wealthiest. But that doesn't help workers. What I want to see is trade deals that benefit workers. I don't work for the rich. I work for you, for Canadians.
Mr. Singh,
Europe and the United States have similar values to Canada's. Why would you oppose those deals? Well, for example, with NAFTA, there's a breach that's been opened up in supply management. There's higher drug prices and no protections for workers or the environment.
Thank you very much, Alec, for your questions. Thank you very much. Next theme. Identity, ethics, and governance. We're going to launch this theme with a question from a Canadian in Montreal. Louise Pigeon, good evening.
Good evening, Patrice.
We're listening to you. The leaders are listening to your question.
I am 63 years old. I have multiple sclerosis. I've had it for 30 years, and also severe rheumatoid arthritis since I was 12 years old. I can't walk anymore. I'm in pain. I wear adult diapers. I have bed sores, and that's not the end of it. Ms. May and gentlemen, in order that you, your loved ones, and all of us to one day have the right to die in dignity, will you promise voters, yes or no, to soften the current legislation as was recommended by Judge Baudouin of the Quebec Superior Court, without, of course, creating additional obstacles? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pigeon. We'll come back to you after the answers. Ms. May, you're the first one to answer.
Ms. Pigeon, I am truly touched by your situation, and I offer you my sympathies, and I offer you a commitment, because we have to change that legislation. I have made efforts in Parliament when we studied the bill to allow the right to die with dignity and to give people the right to choose the time to die with dignity. And I will do the same thing in the next Parliament.
Ms. May, Mr. Singh.
My answer is yes. Thank you so much for having the courage to ask such a difficult question and for sharing your difficult story. That takes a lot of courage, and I'd like to thank you for that, Ms. Pigeon. Clearly, with the Quebec court decision, the options are too limited, and dignity is being denied. What I would do is remove the restrictions. It's too limited. I want to give you more autonomy, more power to die with dignity. It's a difficult decision, but you have to have access to that important right. So yes, I agree, it can be done.
The answer is obviously yes. This is a new phenomenon. This is a law, a philosophy that is new, both in Quebec and Canada. I want to congratulate you, as well as those who went before the courts, because you started to own this issue. And you said, we want to participate and we want to help decide how this will apply. I believe that governments must clearly commit into respecting this judgment. Of course, we can work on improving these laws, but yes, that ruling should be respected.
Thank you, Ms. Pigeon, for your question and for your courage in being here with us this evening. This is a very personal question for people and for families, and we need to be there as a government to help you navigate these difficult questions. Yes, we are going to relax the law in the next 6 months, because we have recognized from the beginning that this was a new law. We had to find a balance between protecting the most vulnerable and respecting people's rights and people's individual choices. And we understood even 3 or 4 years ago when we proposed this law that the courts and that society, everyone was going to evolve, and we will continue to evolve with them. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for your question, and you have all of my sympathies. This is a very personal issue for you. I think that this is a subject on which all parties in Parliament try to unite to respond to tribunal decisions whilst trying to find a balance to protect vulnerable people. We will always respect court decisions. At the same time, we will evaluate the decision. Like Mr. Blanchet said, this is a completely new system, and so we need to try and find the right path forward.
Conclusion, Mr. Bernier.
Indeed, this legislation needs to be overhauled. I can tell you that I did vote in favour of the bill to die with dignity. We're in favour of individual responsibility and freedom at the People's Party of Canada, and I am prepared to make an undertaking to have this legislation overhauled, such that those people who want to make this difficult choice with their loved ones by their side, so that they are able to make this difficult choice. And you have the support of the People's Party of Canada, Madam.
Thank you, Ms. Pigeon. You are so courageous for being here with us tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for being so brave, for coming here this evening. I know it wasn't easy, but this was an important debate, and things are going to advance. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
We're moving on to our next three-way debate. Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau, and Mr. Bernier. Obviously, we received a lot of emails about secularism. So I'm going to ask all three of you a rather simple question. Are you going to intervene to challenge Bill 21 on secularism? And if so, at what stage? Give us some details, because we get the impression that you're being really cautious to not displease Quebec's voters, and things are being very confusing. So please be clear, Mr. Singh. I'll start with you.
Yeah, okay. I've always been clear. I do not want to intervene. What I do want to do is always fight against division. I'm against discrimination. I know a lot of people face discrimination in their lives. It's wholly unacceptable. But I want people to get to know me in Quebec and all across the country. I speak to people, I say, yes, I wear a turban, but I'm in favor of the right to abortion. I'm in favor of fighting climate change. Sure, I wear a turban, but we share the same values. It's all about values. If you want to protect society, you need to reinforce women's rights, their right to choose. That's how you create a fairer society, and that's what I'm willing to do.
I've always been very clear as well. We will not intervene at this stage because this is a question, an issue where Quebecers are challenging this unfair law, or this law that they find unfair, before the courts. It would be irresponsible for a federal government to close the door to ever intervening at a future stage when freedoms and fundamental rights are at issue. We need to be there to protect francophones outside of Quebec. We need to be there to fight for the rights of women, for the rights of the LGBTQ community, and for the rights of religious minorities. I will always defend the rights of everyone, and we'll see when we come to the next stages.
Trudeau has just told us that he would get involved, and Mr. Singh said the very opposite to what he said in English just a few days ago. Not true. Let me finish, Mr. Singh. I will stick by my word. This is a Quebec area of jurisdiction. Secularism in Quebec, it's the way things are now. It's a Quebec area of jurisdiction. We have to honour that. And we can't step in and ride roughshod over Quebec's areas of jurisdiction. We're not going to intervene like Mr. Trudeau has indicated he will, and we're not going to hem and haw.
Not true.
Mr. Singh, you said at a press conference after your last debate that you would intervene at the Supreme Court stage. Can you give us more details?
I simply repeated a fact, what Mr. Trudeau said, and I repeated it. What I said clearly was that I do not want to intervene. I don't want to. What I do want to do is to win over the hearts of people. That's what I've always said. That's what I want to do, because I know that the politics of division is not good for society. It's harmful.
I was very clear that there is a possibility that the federal government might need to intervene, but it's not guaranteed, Mr. Bernier, because we are going to let the court case follow its course. But I think Canadians expect that a federal government be there to defend, for example, francophone communities. If, for example, a conservative majority government under Doug Ford wanted to attack francophones in Ontario, they expect a federal government to be there to defend them. It's expected that a federal government will be there to defend the rights of women against a provincial federal government that would want to take away those rights. We will be there to defend fundamental rights for all.
Mr. Bernier, conclusion, please.
Well, here's my take on the matter. It's quite simple. There's a consensus in Quebec around secularism, and your position is to, in fact, meddle in a provincial area of jurisdiction, tell Quebec what to do in its own backyard, and we in the People's Party of Canada, we are going to respect the Constitution. Unlike you, we're not going to meddle. In fact, Mr. Legault had political guts to do what he did, and I really respect that. I really respect that. And, you know, if you
last minute, Mr. Singh.
Bandy around Mr. Trudeau discriminatory affected women's rights. It's one thing to say you support them, it's another thing to actually do it. And now, the only place in New Brunswick that offers abortion services is set to close, and you've done nothing to protect that clinic in New Brunswick. How can you say one thing publicly, yes, I'm in favor of this right, but in private, it's not the same thing at all?
Yes, we are very concerned by the decision of the Conservative government in New Brunswick, which is taking a step backwards for women's rights. We worked with the former Liberal government in New Brunswick to improve access to abortion services, and now we see a Conservative government that has been elected that is not there to defend the rights of women, and that's the danger with Mr. Scheer. He won't be there to defend the rights of women.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to move ahead now with another three-way trio with Ms. May, Mr. Scheer, Mr. Blanchet. We're going to go back to secularism later. We're going to keep with the theme of abortion. Mr. Scheer, can you commit to improving access to abortion despite your religious beliefs?
For the final time, I've always been clear on the matter. I am personally pro-life, but we will not change access to abortion or our laws. It didn't change under the previous Liberal or Conservative governments. It will not change with my next government.
I go back to secularism now. I have a question for you.
Go ahead, please.
So I'm going to go back to the three-way debate. If the Supreme Court were to overturn the Quebec secularism law, part of it or all of it, in your opinion, would this revive the sovereignist option?
I don't know what the people of Quebec would do if that were to be the case. But for Quebecers, the notion of secularism, it's a progressive value that comes from the Quiet Revolution. It's welcoming, it protects, it's fair. It's fair for men and women. It's not something that is restrictive in the heart and mind of Quebecers. I appreciate that some say that it's up to Quebec to decide. Now, Mr. Singh, you're not saying the same thing in English and in French. And when we're talking about secularism, Mr. Trudeau speaks about New Brunswick and the right to abortion. Quebecers need to know that they will elect people who are in favor of secularism. The people who would lose before the Supreme Court, would they feel that this is an institutional lack of respect? Well, some might ask themselves that question. I'm convinced that is not the Legault government's intention, that it's not a sovereignist government.
I am the only person who has been clear on the matter. We will not intervene. It's not that we didn't only say we don't want to, we said we won't. That was my position at the very beginning, it's my position today, and it will be my position after the election. What is clear is that Mr. Blanchet's priority is to try and stir up sovereignism once again. He will work with the Parti Québécois the second the elections are over to try and lead to a new referendum. That's his priority, and that's clear.
I do not want to intervene either, but I think it's a bit strange in this federal election. I agree with Chantal Hébert, who wrote today that it is not an issue for a federal election. We've had a debate on Bill 21. I think we've talked more about that than the climate crisis throughout this election. And that worries me. I hope that Quebecers and Quebec as a nation will remain an inclusive society. I think that is an issue for Quebec and Quebecers. But right now, please, we have to talk about what's going to happen in the north of Canada, in the Arctic, people in the Atlantic region. What about farmers? That we haven't talked about it in the debates.
If we could just talk about this for a couple of seconds. Mr. Trudeau said something so strange. We're talking about Law 21, Bill 21, but he is obsessed with Ontario politics and provincial politics. He even put a hypothetical threat to justify his position, his incoherent position on this matter.
But he's not the only one who thinks about bizarre things because you've just said something bizarre yourself. You are
the one who
I'm not Justin Trudeau. Let me speak for a few seconds here. You are saying that the Legault government is basically a pawn of a bloc strategy, and then we're going to
I said that you like to claim these kind of things. You claim being a friend.
October 21st is not the day of a referendum. It's a federal election. When Quebecers will say, do not send to Ottawa people who will do what
you claim being Mr. Legault's best friend.
I've never said
You're hiding your true intentions so that you can foment some more sovereignism in Quebec.
You're on the right way to help us achieve sovereignty.
My policy is to improve the quality of life of all Canadians, to reduce taxes and to make life more affordable. That is my priority.
Stop squabbling, please. I would like to speak a bit, please.
Go ahead.
Yes. So with regard to Bill 21, I think that all of the leaders have a problem because everyone is saying that at the federal level, except Mr. Bernier, that we're against the bill, but at the same time, we have to respect Quebec and court decisions. We have to wait to see what happens with the challenge that's ongoing in Quebec.
Ms. May, we've let you speak. A question, rapid-fire question. There was a lot of talk in recent months in Canada in politics. I'll ask you all the same question.
Would you like to see a remediation agreement for SNC-Lavalin so that it or any company is not found guilty of corruption and not banned from bidding on government contracts for 10 years? Mr. Bernier.
We are the only party, I'm the only leader who said back then that no corporation is above the law, no company is above the law, nor should it be. Now, Mr. Trudeau's government has in fact put a clause in Canadian legislation that provides a way out for corrupt companies. I am adamant that I'm against that. All companies must be treated equally, be on an equal footing. And if they're not treated in that manner, well, Canadians will lose faith in our legal system, in our justice system. It has to be across the board.
It's so hard to say this, but this is the only time I will agree with Mr. Bernier in my life. But in this case, yes.
We have to have a debate
here. This will be the last time. But yes, clearly. What happened was Mr. Trudeau tried to help his CEO cronies, not workers. What this Prime Minister does is help out his buddies, his cronies. When they call, he says, I'll do whatever you want. But I am in favor of people. I work for people. I work for workers. That's what I'm here for. We want a system that is fair.
Mr. Trudeau.
Almost all of our allies in Europe and around the world have a deferred prosecution agreement system which allows a company to pay penalties to change its behavior without punishing the workers who had nothing to do with the decisions that were taken by the upper management. This is a way to protect workers when there is corporate malfeasance. It's a system that works around the world, but the decision as to whether or not this will be given to a company here in Canada belongs to the Attorney General and Justice Minister, and we will respect that decision when it will be taken.
Mr. Blanchet.
There's a lot of things that should be repaired in the remediation agreement. Mr. Trudeau should have done things differently, but he's right. Most Western countries have remediation agreements in their laws. I see that Mr. Bernier and Mr. Singh have a terrible habit to play that Quebec is corrupt card. The 3,400 employees of SNC-Lavalin and the current executive of SNC-Lavalin are not crooks. The shares will be sold. You will have people looking for jobs, and another jewel of our economy will fall down because of the negligence of federalist parties.
The jewel of our country is the independence independence of the judiciary, and Justin Trudeau tried to butt in to an independent decision made by his Attorney General. And when he received a decision that wasn't to his liking, he simply fired her. He tried to undermine our independent judicial apparatus. The decision is the Attorney General's. There's only one job that the Prime Minister wants to save, and that is his own.
Madame May. Ms. May.
Well, I agree with my colleague, Mr. Singh. I agree with Mr. Bernier. There is no business or person who is above the law. And that is why I am disappointed in Mr. Trudeau, because he broke the law by putting pressure against the Attorney General. And at the same time, the omnibus bill that I was talking about earlier, in that same omnibus bill for the budget, where the criminal code was changed to help SNC Lavalin. That is not how you make good decisions.
Ms. May. Open debate now. I'm going to ask you a question, and then it's up to you to respond. It's in a crisis situation that you can measure the judgment and transparency of a leader. You've almost all forgiven some candidates or let them go. Embarrassing candidates. So from now on, can you tell us that there'll be zero tolerance for any candidate or MP who would make any racist comments? Mr. Blanchet.
First, I understand why this question is asked tonight. If any of the candidates had refused to apologize explicitly, they would not be a candidate of the Bloc tonight, because I can state I'm sure that the fact that I wrote in newspapers, that I was on TV before, I know that everybody looked into that with a fine-tooth comb. And I understand that it's the same for my colleagues on stage tonight. What is essential to me in an election campaign is that people can choose for whom they'll vote based on the values they put forth. And we will work for Quebec.
4 examples of people what we had to forgive, you and Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Scheer as well.
I can say is that there is one candidate who did not meet our policy. That is a candidate who breached ethic guidelines twice, who lied about many things in their life. And that is the Liberal Papineau candidate.
Mr. Trudeau.
Apologies are important, but intentions and values and concrete measures that are taken are important as well. And we will always judge on values and actions taken by everyone. It's a part of the election choice before people. Our people representing their values will be there to defend them, and people know that for 4 years I have been defending them, and we will continue to move forward defending those values together.
We're not perfect. I'm not perfect. All the candidates have made mistakes, but what's important is that they take ownership of their mistakes, that they own them, and thereafter we just need to ensure that they share Canadian values, that of tolerance, acceptance, freedom. Our party has been founded on personal responsibility, freedom. All our candidates are expected to live by those principles.
That's a question of authenticity. If a person apologizes but doesn't commit to change in the future, there's no strong commitment to do things differently. So in that case, it would be a no. But if a person says they're sorry and commits to change, if they share our values, they can stay in our party. Our value is to work for people, not for the wealthy. Our value is to defend human rights. We want to advance social justice and fight the climate crisis. We can do this together, and that's exactly the type of candidates and team we have and we need.
I think that we have a problem in our democracy. I have a number of people who've asked me why would someone run for a party in an election in our democracy? Because there are always things that are embarrassing, but to me, it's an issue of the level of their comments. We have zero tolerance for racism, anti-Semitism, sexism. We have zero tolerance. That's clear. But we have to think about this because in the last few weeks in this election, we have spent an awful lot of time on small politics and not to try to find a way to work together to fight the climate emergency. And to my last breath, I will try to stop the climate emergency.
We need to work together. We need to make the right choice. We need to move forward to fight against climate change, and we will continue to move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Scheer, Mr. Blanchet, and then we'll conclude.
The choice for this election is clear. 4 more years of tax hikes, of more expensive lives, or a Conservative government that will make life more affordable for everyone.
We'll be in the House of Commons. We will vote in favor of what's good for Quebec against what is not good for Quebec.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, leaders. Thank you very much. Overall, you were relatively disciplined. Thank you. October 21st is voting day. So we'll be here on the set at Radio Canada. Thank you for your attention tonight. I'd like to thank the whole team.
Welcome to a special post-debate edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Capellos. The final leaders' debate of election 2019 has just moments ago wrapped up. 6 leaders faced off in French for 2 hours. Will it change voters' minds in the remaining 10 days of the campaign? Who made an impression? We have extensive analysis ahead. In a few moments, we will hear from the leaders as they speak to reporters. We'll, of course, bring that to you live, but joining me to help walk us through the debate and what came of it is the Power Panel in Toronto, Melissa Lantzman of Hill & Knowlton Strategies, and with me in studio, Yolande James, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister, and Françoise Boivin, political commentator and former NDP MP. And shortly joining us, Radio Canada's Daniel Thibeault. He's filing his story at the moment. As soon as he's finished, he'll run over here and accompany us throughout the next hour and a half or so while those debates are happening. Françoise, I'll start with you right to the point. What stood out for you? What's your verdict on this?
I know it was much more understandable because less moments where they were all talking on top of one another. You'll say I'm a contradiction, but I was a bit bored by it because I heard so many lines that I heard so often since the beginning of this campaign that it just went like wah, wah, a few times, just like that. So there were a few good moments. Andrew Scheer was way better than he was at the TVA. So I don't think anybody can say that he was not alive and kicking a bit. But I was surprised by Yves-François Blanchet that he was not more... He's got an advance. In a sense, I suspect that he had the Trudeau virus from TVA, which was to stay a bit back, try to be less, not to attack, and just put a few of his lines to show that he was the only one holding a certain position, like on Bill 21 again. But other than that, I thought it was pretty... non-existent.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Yolanda. I wonder what you think. I mean, the format was very different than the English language debate on Monday night, and you could tell the primary difference was that they were divided into groups and able to debate each other, but they also rarely spoke over each other compared to Monday. Mm-hmm. And I sort of had that sense as well, Françoise, that everybody was kind of more subdued.
Everybody was more subdued. So I wouldn't go maybe as far as saying that it was boring, but at some point I was like, okay, everybody, liven up, a little bit of fire here. We want to see this going, and that it would happen. And I think the idea of breaking, not often on air, breaking them up in batches of 3 for the format, I think, was a bit easier. I have a little bit of a different take on Yves-François in the sense that, he didn't attack as much, but I felt like he did use the floor to be very in French you say professoral, like when he would speak, notably on foreign affairs, it's like this is how it works, and he would go on, and we kind of wanted to hear him a little bit more on, I guess, what he would do, but he can't really say that given that he's never going to be in government with respect to that. I just kind of look at it in terms of, did each person meet their objective? I think for Andrew Scheer, given that he was, I think, a bit better than he was at TVA, I think can reassure certain candidates that are already strong, but that might be a little bit afraid of seeing their vote completely slide away. He gave enough of a performance to keep that going. I think about the Quebec region and so forth. Maxime Bernier took a lot of space. Mm-hmm. You could see that he was in his language, and he did not miss the opportunity to land those punches. It's interesting because on things like Bill 21, him and Yves-François Blanchet are on exactly the same page, so he was kind of giving those lines out. So Yves-François was kind of erased in that. Will that have an impact on the vote? I'm not sure. We'll have to see in the next polls, I guess.
Melissa, prior to the debate, you had said you were looking to see who would be directly speaking to Quebecers here. Did anyone jump out in that capacity during this debate for you?
Well, actually, the format of the debate allowed, those who were substantive in policy to actually speak to Quebecers. I think this debate favored policy rather than platitudes, and I think you saw that with Jagmeet Singh, who repeated a lot of the same lines that he had on Monday, but frankly didn't go much deeper. I think in terms of Andrew Scheer, I think his goal was to really tie Monsieur Blanchet to the separatist PQ, and I think that he took multiple opportunities to do that. I think he had a much better debate, frankly, than he did on TVA before, and gave some confidence to the candidates who are running close and in ridings that he needs to win. I think Monsieur Blanchet was rather surprising. I think he owned a good part of the debate, but he frankly wasn't challenged as much as I thought he would be by the Prime Minister and nor by the Conservative leader. And I think the Prime Minister, I think he started frankly strong and then sort of sat back and a bit absent throughout the rest of the debate.
I want to pick up on two things that you mentioned in there. And the first is the amount of time people spent focused on Mr. Blanchet. Everyone prior to the debate had speculated that given the sort of upswing in polls for the Bloc in the past few weeks, you would see them sort of sharpen their lines of attack on Mr. Blanchet. I think Melissa is right. They weren't quite as pointed. I want to play a clip, one exchange where the leader of the Conservative Party, Mr. Scheer, went after Mr. Blanchet. That's the 6th clip for the control room. Let's play that one and take a listen.
So in other words, voting for the Bloc is voting for Liberals, voting for the Bloc is voting for the Conservatives, voting for the Bloc is voting for Quebec. We will sit in the House of Commons. It's a democracy. Number one. Number two, Mr. Legault and the government of Quebec has asked the powers, not a power, all the immigration powers. You should all commit to give Quebec every power pertaining to immigration.
You like to claim that you are Mr. Legault's best friend, but please be honest with me. After the election, you will be working for Canadians?
I have news for you, Mr. Scheer.
Who will you vote for in the next provincial elections?
If I can say so politely, I mean,
are you going to be your best friends with Legault? Be honest with Canadians. Will you work with the Parti Québécois?
So that was one of the parts that they were talking over each other. Françoise, you had a reaction there.
Well, yeah, thank God that didn't last for 2 hours, because we would have shut the sound in the green room here. But it was an interesting exchange, but to the point of why was Mr. Blanchet not so attacked that we thought he would be, since he's kind of the front runner or on an
an ascent.
Exactly. Yes. I was rethinking that whole concept, and I think the other leaders just didn't want him to be either a victim or at the same time to shine too much. So sometimes, because I remember when I used to do debates and we didn't know who would ask which question of whom and everything, a lot of the people would say, technically, they shouldn't ask you any questions because it will permit you to take the floor and everything. And they would make that mistake. So I think they were probably well advised not to give him too much floor to do so. He took it when he needed to do so. But I stick to I didn't find that he was that shiny today. He didn't seem as at ease, except when he was professorial on certain aspects, but that's him. When he talks, he doesn't talk, he teaches.
He was a lot more defensive than he was in the TVA debate, and I hear your point, Françoise. It's like they have to find the right tone, because if you go too deep on the attack, then you give him the opportunity to be, I use the word victim, but Quebecers can kind of rally around him and be like, I don't like that. Why are you doing that?
Ganged up on him.
Don't gang up on him like that. I don't like that. But at the same time, that clip, even though we didn't hear much of it, was a perfect opportunity to challenge François Blanchet. Whether the Prime Minister didn't do it, neither did Andrew Scheer. And I think they should have. It's either you're going to be going to Parliament to work for sovereignty, or you're just a spokesperson. Are you François Legault's spokesperson? Because listening to what you just answered just there is that you're just there to repeat what he has to say. So just to kind of make him speak a little bit more, I think would have been helpful.
If the strategy on the part of Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Scheer to not go as hard as the anticipation was on Mr. Blanchet was there, if it was deliberate, Melissa, what do you think is behind that strategy?
I actually think Mr. Scheer did go after Mr. Blanchet, and it was the exact tie that Yolande just mentioned. It was to tie him to a separatist agenda, to ensure that Quebecers know that maybe he's not working for them in Parliament, but working towards the goal of sovereignty. He did that a couple times, and I think that's what he was there to do. What's disappointing is Mr. Trudeau, frankly, not doing that. I mean, the Bloc is frankly going to eat their lunch as well in some of the francophone ridings that they need to pick up on. And this is his first language. This was the opportunity. I think Mr. Scheer did, frankly, as well as he could on that, given that he so stated that French wasn't his first language.
As I mentioned off the top of the show, Danielle Thibault is here to join us
Hello.
now. Hello, nice to see you.
Hey,
I want to bring you into this part of the conversation. You heard Melissa there. We had been talking about, prior to the debate, we had a conversation about how we expected, because of the polls, Mr. Blanchet to be the target of more attacks. What was your impression?
It was Mr. Trudeau went on the offensive early on, but in a very, very soft manner, I'd say. And I was expecting him to be stronger, given what Melissa just said given the situation the Liberals are facing right now in Quebec, because the Bloc is eating away at their support in some region around Montreal and the regions as well. So on that front, I thought that Mr. Trudeau was going to go a little harder. It came back a little later in the debate, if I'm not mistaken, during the portion on the Bill 21, or just before, where everybody kind of ganged up on Mr. Blanchet for about a minute and a half. But not as strongly as I thought they would go. Much tamer debate than I was expecting. Very, very.
We were all saying subdued, right?
Yeah. And
why do you think that is?
You know what? I was asking myself the same question on the way in. I'm not quite sure. It was someone somewhere must have thought that going too strongly was probably not the way to go, and might have turned the voters slightly more towards the Bloc. So I know that the Liberals were hoping to point out repeatedly throughout the evening that a vote for the Bloc was basically a vote to stay out of the government and a vote to stall climate change, for example. If you want to work towards that, come and join the government. That was supposed to be the underlying message.
They had telegraphed.
I didn't hear that as much.
No.
I didn't hear that as much as I was expecting. So did someone at some point thought, if we go too hard, that may backfire on us? I don't know. I will have to talk to some people in the war room because that part still puzzles me.
Me as well. If you're just joining us now, you're watching a special extended edition of Power in Politics, post-debate version of Power in Politics. We're standing by here with the Power panel breaking down what we just witnessed, the final debate of this election campaign 2019. It was in French, of course. We're going to put the Power panel on pause for a moment while we take a commercial break, but when we come back, we'll keep talking about the debate and we'll also bring you the leaders' scrums. They're going to be talking to reporters shortly and we'll bring you those live. Stay with us. We're back in a moment. Welcome back to a very special late night edition of Power in Politics. I'm Vashi Capellos. Just moments ago, the French leaders debate wrapped up. We're waiting to hear from those leaders as they speak with reporters, which we'll bring to you live. But helping us with some post-debate analysis is our Power panel this evening, Melissa Lantzman, Yolande James, Françoise Boivin, and Danielle Thibault. Françoise, we were just having a lively conversation here still about trying to figure out what the strategy was about not focusing more on the bloc in this debate. What do you think the overall consequence of that is? Like, if you walk away from this debate, and I know I take your point on that it was very subdued, do you think does it change anything? It's early as well.
I said boring, but
okay.
I'm
like Yolanda, I'm being more polite. It's my job to be diplomatic. Yeah.
That sounds so much better. Yes.
But does it mean that we just, is it a zero sum, you just walk away status quo, or what happens?
I think that there are some leaders of two main parties that maybe they think that if we don't make too much noise, maybe things will go back to normal. but it won't happen. Campaigns have these weird ways of happening. Like I still go back to 2015, but you've got a party who's way ahead, and then suddenly you see your support.
Losing.
You're losing support by percentage in astronomical, and you start thinking and multiplying by the number of days left, and you think, oh my goodness, will we survive the election, election night? And I think it's quite the gamble they took, Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau, because I'm not sure that the Bloc will go down.
If everything goes according to time, Mr. Trudeau is coming out in a few minutes, so I want to get one final comment from both Melissa and Yolande. Melissa, do you hear me?
Oh, yeah, no,
sorry.
I hear you.
Sorry. I just wanted to get a final comment from you about whether or not you think there is an overall impact to this debate, recognizing, of course, that we're minutes away, minutes out.
Look, I think in terms of if you got a more substantive debate, you got some clear policy positions from some leaders, some not so clear ones from others, and that's particularly Mr. Singh and I think Mr. Trudeau that we're wobbling on a few. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that we've seen anything substantially move numbers in this election when it comes to issues. We haven't figured out a ballot question. I don't think we will after this campaign, not even in Quebec for Quebec voters.
Well, it's interesting because it's hard to always, when we come fresh out of it, and what's I think different from all of us is that we've really analyzed every single debate, and I try to keep in mind that for most people they'll probably just watch one. So for that person,
if that, most people are not like this,
and maybe the first half hour of one. So for the person who really watched this debate to say, okay, this is the French language debate that I want to look at, what are they going to take away? What I think they do see substance there. I do think that they saw a prime minister that did try to speak to the population and win back the confidence of voters. But was it enough? The question I cannot answer at this point. Was it enough? It certainly will not reverse the ascent of the Bloc. That's not happening. But was it enough to stop it? And that's an open question for me at this
it's
point.
a difficult one to judge right now.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to thank the three of you for sticking with us for so long this evening. I appreciate it very much. Thanks to the Power Panel, Melissa Lantsman, Yolande James, and Françoise Boisman. We're going to head right over there, back to the Museum of History to listen in to Mr. Trudeau.
Moins que je me trompe, impose un test de valeur comme critère d'obtention du certificat de sélection du Québec. Est-ce que c'est vrai, vous êtes d'accord avec un test?
Criteria. Yes, Quebec can impose a test they want on the certificate of selection criteria. It's their responsibility. They can choose the questions. But do you agree with that test? Well, we would have to see the questions on that test before I determine how I feel about it. Quebec has the right, though, to set such a test for the selection certificate.
Has the power to impose or to ask a particular test for a selection certificate that Quebec has the power to deliver. The questions on that test are to be determined by Quebec.
Ikian RNN, have you, your campaign, or any other agents secured non-disclosure agreements from anyone about inappropriate sexual personal conduct?
No.
Follow-up, the 2001 yearbook from West Point Grey Academy says that you and convicted sex offender Christopher Ingvaldson made a young student's, quote, life at WPGA a lot more interesting / amusing, end quote. How did you two keep her amused?
We were teachers.
Good evening, Prime Minister. Andrew Lawton from True North. In English and in French, please. When you were accused of, in her words, groping a young woman at the Kokanee Music Festival, you said that people can experience things differently. When you look back at your career at West Point Grey Academy, were there any episodes, any chapters, any incidents where, looking back, you may have, in your view or in the view of anyone else involved, acted inappropriately?
No.
Okay, thank you. And a follow-up to that, sir. I mean, these are questions we're asking publicly because your office has not answered them privately. Do you think they are relevant, given that you have been accused of bullying women you've worked with, firing women that have stood up to you, and accused of groping women? Do you realize that these are important questions?
We live in a democracy where people are allowed to ask questions and where Canadians will make their decisions. I am extremely confident in the values that I've always put forward and the work that I've done for Canadians, and I know that Canadians will base their decision in 10 days on facts and not on internet rumors.
Michel Lamarche, TVA Nouvelle.
Concerning the values test by the Legault government, you said it depends on the questions. What do you do? So if the questions suit you, that's okay. If not, what happens? I don't know. I don't know the questions they will be putting on the to the candidates. But Quebec has the right to set that test for the selection certificate issued by Quebec. It has nothing to do with Canadian citizenship. It's a Quebec process belonging to the Quebec government. And I fully trust that the Quebec government will ask relevant questions for their government. During the debate, you left the door open to a pipeline crossing Quebec. Why didn't you say clearly that there will be no pipeline going through Quebec if the Liberal government didn't want to go there? Well, there is no project on the horizon right now. But there is no social acceptability for a pipeline that would run across Quebec. And we will never impose a pipeline on Quebec. That is Andrew Scheer's plan.
David Menzies, Rebel News. Mr. Prime Minister, you left West Point Grey Academy in the middle of a term, which is highly unusual. It was a law firm that made this announcement, which is also highly unusual. Sir, can you tell us the real reason why you left so abruptly, and did it involve any kind of sexual misconduct at the school?
I wrote 3 pages on that in my autobiography, and it involved absolutely nothing of the sort of the rumors that you're trying to spread.
Even so, Mr. Prime Minister, a follow-up question. Why did so many teenage girls write so passionately about you in the yearbook? Was there any connection to you having a relationship with these girls or their mothers?
I was a good teacher.
Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Your government has introduced papers in court that say that the compensation in the Human Rights Tribunal ruling would cost $8 billion or upwards of $8 billion. Are you willing to pay that much money, or are you challenging that total cost?
We agree with the tribunal's call for compensation of these victims. We will work to compensate those victims. We've done this in the past with the 60s scoop, with the day schools, with the TB, with the forced relocations. We will be compensating those individuals, but more than just compensating from the past, we have made changes to the law around child and family services to ensure that Indigenous kids are kept in Indigenous communities when they need care.
So do you support, if you are re-elected, would you move forward with giving $8 billion in compensation for these kids?
We will work with communities, we will work with families, we will work in an appropriate way with Indigenous peoples to determine the appropriate compensation.
Simon Guy-Lorange de La Presse. Encore une fois,
Simon Guy-Lorange of La Presse. Once again, on the values test by the Legault government, you say you trust that the Quebec government will ask the right questions. On the Secularism Act, you say you open the door, you keep the door open to a Supreme Court challenge. But on the values test, the Quebec government has the green light and can ask any question they want. Well, the Canada-Quebec immigration agreement leaves Quebec the choice of who will receive a selection certificate as they see fit. Quebec will determine the process. This is power that Quebec does have under the Canada-Quebec immigration agreement. The federal government has no say in that selection certificate process. It's up to Quebec to determine what questions will be put to the candidates. regarding the selection certificate, but concerning obtaining Canadian citizenship, that is up to the federal government, and for that, there will be no values test. Yet, if, for instance, in the values test, there are questions about religious affiliation, should the federal government intervene? Well, I don't want to deal with hypotheticals.
CBC News. You mentioned in French tonight that you said voting bloc would bring back Harperites. Do you think that will scare Quebec voters?
I think what is clear is that Quebecers want to be part of the action, not part of the opposition. We have a government for the past 4 years has led the way on fighting climate change, that has stood up to lift kids out of poverty, invest in our seniors, move forward in investing in infrastructure, protecting language, investing in culture. And we were able to do that because Quebecers stood up to be part of a strong federal government. In the 10 years that Mr. Harper was in power, a strong Bloc Québécois in Ottawa was unable to prevent Mr. Harper from doing nothing on climate change, for leaving Kyoto, for not advancing investments in culture, indeed in cutting in culture. Quebecers want to be part of holding strong against conservative politicians like Doug Ford and Jason Kenney, who are in the pockets of big oil, who don't want to fight climate change. And in order to do that, we need a strong federal government with great Quebecers as part of it.
My follow is, if you had to work with another party in a minority situation, which one would you choose?
We are focused on winning a majority government because we know that in order to move forward with a climate change plan that pushes back against those conservative premiers like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford who want to do nothing, we need a strong and clear mandate from Canadians. That's exactly what we're hoping to get in 10 days.
Mark Leahy, the Lowdown to Hull and Back News.
One more. Okay.
Oh, yes, thank you. Mark Leahy, Lowdown to Hull and Back News. Mr. Trudeau, in 2015, you ran on a mandate to change the electoral system under electoral reform. You didn't follow through on that promise, betrayed the votes of several million young people who may or may not want to back you this time, in light of some recent revelations around blackface. That same sort of demographic may have some problems following you this time. What do you plan to do to find a way to restore their faith in democracy? We've made it clear that we're going to invest in young people to help them be able to access post-secondary education and better jobs. That's why we're raising the Canada Student Grants from the $2,000 that Mr. Harper left them to $4,200 for low and middle income students. We're also in making sure that you don't have to start paying back your student loans until you're making $35,000 a year. And if you start a family, while you have a child under 5, you don't have to pay back student loans. We're also giving a 2-year grace period that's going to make a big difference. We moved forward with a national youth policy that was developed by young people, including young people in my Prime Minister's Youth Council, because we know having young people part of shaping a better future is essential for all Canadians. So no comment on democracy. Thank you. You're welcome.
That was Liberal leader Justin Trudeau speaking to reporters following the French language leaders debate over at the Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. I'm sitting here with Radio-Canada's Danielle Thibault, the host of Les Coulisses du Pouvoir, and we are just listening to this scrum. A couple of things stuck out. First, just a quick note that our colleague Hannah Thibodeau tried to get Mr. Trudeau to bite on the concept of the possibility of a majority government.
That's not going to happen now.
He didn't. No, he instead said, no, we're focused on a majority. I wanted to actually get your take on something that dominated the questions you received from French media, and that is something Mr. Legault, Premier Legault in Quebec, has put forward around immigration.
Value test, right?
Right.
The value test was put forward during the campaign, and basically the question was, would you be opposed to that? Would you challenge that? Mr. Trudeau fell back to the agreement, the immigration agreement between Ottawa and Quebec that says basically, and Quebec, if I'm not mistaken, is the only province that has that kind of power. Basically, you're agreeing to take that many people every year, but you have full control over who you're taking in, aside from the refugee category. And so basically, if Quebec will release a acceptation certificate to all of to the ones that are coming in, and if they want to impose some sort of a test to see if they should get into the province, what Mr. Trudeau is saying is that we're open to them. They have the power to do so. He's not saying he's not going to challenge it. He's just saying, I need to see what they're going to come up with once they do that. But obviously, he's opening the door fairly wide to say, Quebec has jurisdiction on that front. And that's because it is something that's been debated last year during the provincial election. It's something that's dear to a lot of Quebecers. And at this point, I think Mr. Trudeau is trying not to alienate any more Quebecers during this campaign, not to push them towards the Bloc, who is quite comfortable with the idea of a value testing for newcomers.
And the polls, even today, Angus Reid, Léger, both showing that the Liberals and other parties, for example, in Quebec, have something to be worried about.
It's fascinating because we started to see a bit of a shift, I'd say, about a week and a half ago, and we couldn't quite understand how quick and how big it was getting, but the shift is sizable, and what it means basically for Mr. Trudeau at this point is that when they started this campaign, the Liberals were hoping to get into Quebec and keep their seats, and privately, a lot of them were saying, we'd like to come out of Quebec with a plus 15 number. Mm-hmm. We'd like to basically compensate for the ones we're expecting to lose in the Maritimes.
Right.
And
which they had swept in 2015.
Yes, exactly, because it's a given in their head. It's a given that they're going to come out of the Atlantic provinces with at least 8 seats less, and so the idea is let's go through Quebec.
I hate to interrupt you. Yes. I apologize, but we're going to head back over to the museum and listen to Bloc leader. And we were just talking about Yves-François Blanchet.
Well, it's because we're happy that the debate is over. So I'm happy that the debate is done. But the experience is extremely enriching because this is the first time I'm doing this. And this evening, I think it did contribute a lot, I must say, with Mr. Roy's help. This helped really enlighten a lot of voters in Quebec. That's it. Mr. Blanchet, Philippe Vincent Frozy of Radio-Canada. At what point in the next 4 years will the Bloc Québécois' role be to help the Parti Québécois and the sovereignist cause? Well, let me tell you an anecdote. Early in the year 2000, Gilles Jusset, under a minority conservative government, got over $3 billion to compensate part of the fiscal imbalance. And to do that, he collaborated with Jean Charest, leader of the Liberal Party and Premier of Quebec. You can't claim that Jean Charest has ever been a top militant for sovereignty. So our top priority is to bring the Quebec National Assembly consensus to Ottawa. I don't want to use the word bad faith, but there is a short-term tactic in suggesting that the Bloc campaign is not sincere when we talk about amplifying the voice of Quebec in Ottawa and projecting Quebec interests, whereas that's all we're doing during the campaign. There is something inconsistent in having a party leader trying to find a way to hit somebody and who at the end of an election campaign says, well, the Bloc is avoiding independence and suddenly saying that is the foundation of all our actions. Well, people will decide for themselves on that. My commitment is that I will take the national consensus at the National Assembly in Quebec to the party that seems, in the last few days, I've seen many cases where Mr. Bérubé agreed with Mr. Legault. And we also agreed because we're both nationalist parties. But to answer the question now, this time, what is the what is the Bloc doing about sovereignty? All Bloc candidates want Quebec to have all the attributes of sovereignty. That this will happen the way Quebec wants it. The period of strong speeches is over, but we're talking about this issue everywhere because the question keeps arising. The sovereignist movement must go through a period where we have to redefine ourselves, and that's okay. That includes Québec Solidaire and the Parti Québécois, and people who don't belong to a political party but who believe it's a good idea. So how will this happen? How will this progress? I don't know. And when, I don't know either, but I think that this is important to about a third of Quebecers. Mr. Blanchet Michel Lamarche of TVA News. For a few days now, we've heard Mr. Trudeau tell Quebecers that if they choose to elect Bloc MPs, they would be electing a conservative government that will be cutting. And Mr. Trudeau said he's the only one who can stand up to Jason Kenney and Doug Ford and the big oil companies. Do you believe that Mr. Trudeau is playing a dangerous game by setting one part of Canada against the other? Well, maybe that is Mr. Trudeau's new strategy, to stand up as the person who will put Quebec in its place in Jean Chrétien's tradition. However, my approach has always been the same, and it's quite simple. I will vote depending on what is good for Quebec. I will vote against anything that is bad for Quebec, understanding fully that we will be negotiating and will be achieving something for Quebec. People always say, well, Quebec should always be part of the government. There were big bloc years when Quebec did make some gains. Let's look at the last time the Conservatives had the majority of seats in Quebec. That was in '88. It's been a while since we haven't had Conservatives to save us. Whereas today, Quebec is doing well. Before 2015, when the Liberals had the majority of candidates in Quebec, the last time was in the early 80s, when they forced the Constitution down our throats. So Quebec, at several times, has had a lot of Bloc MPs, and it did not hurt us. Quite the contrary. We had people expressing themselves in Ottawa, speaking for Quebec. But today, you chose to keep within your ranks 4 people who made Islamophobic statements. Is that politically advantageous right now for the Bloc Québécois to keep those people within your ranks? What kind of message does that send to voters? Well, for me to think that way, to feel that by keeping candidates who shared some Islamophobic statements, that I think it will bring me votes where I would have to be so cynical. And that has never crossed my mind. I can, and I did say this a while ago, I presume that people who wanted to look through all the articles I wrote and the hundreds of hours of TV time that I did provide, and in the tens of thousands of messages that I put on social media, they never found anything that showed me to be cynical or Islamophobic. So my answer is clearly no. Those people were severely reprimanded for statements shared previously. They apologized, just like the candidates of the other parties did, and I understood during the debate that all leaders were on the same wavelength on this issue.
With CTV National News. If you look at most polls, the Liberals and Conservatives are still tied in first place. In the case of a Conservative minority, if your party, if right now is polling anywhere between 20 and 30%, if you could, in the case of a minority Conservative government, would you prop them up and form a coalition government?
No.
How come?
Because if something is proposed in the Parliament, which is good for Quebec, we will vote in favor of it. If something is proposed which is not good for Quebec, we will go against it. And we are not there to participate in any government. We are there only to carry the voice, and only the voice of Quebec in that Parliament.
And what about the Liberals?
Same thing.
Hello, Hannah Thibodeau with CBC National News. I'd like to ask you about something that Mr. Trudeau said in the debate tonight. He said that by voting Bloc, it is like bringing back Harperites. What?
That's, when you speak to Mr. Harper, he says that voting for the Bloc is a vote for Liberals. And if you speak to Liberals, they will say that voting for the Bloc is voting for the Conservatives. And you know what? Voting for the Bloc is voting for the Bloc. Is voting for what we carry, what we share, what we want, what we propose. And for a large part of our program and the way we carry what l'Assemblée nationale du Québec asks, voting for the Bloc might be voting for Quebec.
What do you think of the fact that Mr. Trudeau now has you in his targets over the past couple of days?
Actually, it's kind of a compliment. I kind of acknowledge the fact that in the last few days, for some reasons that belong to them only, most leaders have decided to be somewhat more aggressive against the Bloc Québécois. It might mean that we have become again a significant player in politics and that we have gained respect from and for Quebec.
Bonjour, Monsieur Blanchet.
Hi, Mr. Blanchet. Firstly, you said you would be getting some money back by selling Trans Mountain. What did you mean by that? Well, is the federal government invest $4.5 billion to buy Trans Mountain, and after that they invest $9, $10, $11 billion to complete the operation? Well, those are projections made by the Canadian government, and by not doing that, that money could be used elsewhere over a period of time that could be spread out. And you said you're in a hurry to get back to your campaign bus. Do you think you were shaken up this evening? Not particularly, no. I felt that the debate was, there was a free flow of ideas during the debate. It was rather elegant, and there were not too many low blows that I noticed. So that wasn't what I meant. There was some pleasure in participating in the debate, and well, there is pleasure in meeting your militants and people that you know and people that you may not know but whom you want to introduce yourself to. And on several occasions, I changed many aspects of my platform because it came from the people. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet speaking to reporters over at the Museum of History following the French language leaders debate that just took place. I'm sitting here with Danielle Thibault, host of Radio-Canada's Les Coulisses du Pouvoir. A couple of things stuck out there for you. There was something that he said at the end there. That
right at the end, the last question, and the question was, did you feel you were pushed around during the evening? And he said, no, not that much. And you know what? He wasn't pushed around that much. And I bet you Mr. Blanchet was expecting to be roughed out much more than what you saw tonight. There was a couple of attacks. There was a couple of lines, both from, actually at some point, from all of them. Mr. Trudeau, I think, was the first one to go on the offensive early on, in a very calm manner, but basically pointing out, and that was talked about during the scrum as well, pointing out that a vote for the Bloc is a vote for a conservative government, minority and majority.
He said it'd be bringing back the Harper rights.
Yes, exactly. And so basically, I think that was setting the tone. At that point, I thought, okay, they're opening the attack line, and we'll see that coming back. And then nothing for a long, long time. And then later on, I believe it was Mr. Scheer who went on the offensive, and then everyone ganged up, and everyone kind of added their say to that. And Mr. Blanchet walks out of there looking like he was the adult in the room to a certain degree, very quiet, very calm. Took it in, answered calmly every time someone brought something negative towards him, towards the Bloc, made his points, and he said, no, you know, it was a good moment. It was a good way to talk about ideas, and it was not. We say cacophonique in French. It was easy to listen.
It was not like Monday where everyone was all
where
over
people
each other.
were talking over each other.
He also was asked by Hannah about his own, are you worried about the tax coming your way type of thing? What do you think of being targeted?
Yeah.
And he said it's actually a compliment.
Yeah, no, and it is a compliment, because if people start paying attention the way they do right now to the Bloc Québécois, and they are, it shows that they're gaining in popularity, because for the major part of the campaign early on, there was no mention of the Bloc in either from the Libs or the Conservatives. No one was saying anything, and it was part of the campaign strategy. And I was told by people in the war room on both sides, you know, they're not that strong, they're not making that much of a difference. Basically, we can surf around, we can do our campaign, we can go with our plan and make it happen that way without worrying too much about them. I think that changed now.
And here is Conservative leader Andrew Scheer speaking to reporters. Let's listen in live.
I'm very satisfied with my performance tonight. I wonder how many conjugation mistakes I made, but I hope that Francophone viewers will excuse me for the mistakes. So I'm ready for your questions, and thank you for being here.
Mr. Scheer, what do you make of the fact that Conservatives are already talking about a party that doesn't include you at the top?
I reject the premise of that question.
How do you reject it? It's on the record.
What I know is that our entire team is excited for the election of October 21st. We've got great candidates all throughout the country who are working hard to replace Justin Trudeau and his record of massive deficits, tax hikes, and scandals with a Conservative Party under my leadership that will lower taxes, make life more affordable, and run an ethical and transparent government.
But Conservatives seem to have a fallback plan if you don't win.
I completely reject the premise of that. We're going to win on October 21st.
David Menzies, Rebel News. Mr. Scheer, only 6% of Canadians indicate they want to see immigration increased, yet you are on board with the Trudeau Liberals' plan to increase immigration to 350,000 migrants per year. Why is that?
What I've always said is that our immigration targets should be based on the realities of our economic needs and our demographic needs. We have a population that needs immigration to continue to grow. We have an economy that continues to need workers to